The thunder of hooves pounded against the storm-lashed earth like the drums of war, each beat echoing the hammering of Cassandra Wright's broken heart as she urged her dying horse through the treacherous canyon walls of Devil's Backbone. Lightning split the black sky above, illuminating her blood-streaked face for a terrifying instant before plunging her back into darkness. Behind her, the bounty hunter's shouts grew closer, their bullets whining off the red sandstone cliffs like angry hornets. "No more pain," she whispered through gritted teeth. One arm clutched against her shattered ribs where her husband's boot had found its mark 3 days ago. "My ribs are already broken." The words were torn away by the howling wind, but they carried with them all the agony of a woman who had discovered that the man she'd married was a monster, and that loving him had nearly cost her everything. Her chestnut mare stumbled on the loose shale, nearly sending them both tumbling into the abyss below. Cassandra bit back a scream as the jarring motion sent white-hot spears of pain through her chest. The leather saddlebags containing the damning evidence of Nathaniel Wright's crimes bounced against her leg, their weight both a burden and the only hope for justice in 3 territories. Inside those bags lay photographs of massacred Apache families, forged land deeds and correspondence that would hang her husband and half the territorial government if she could just stay alive long enough to deliver them. The storm had been her salvation and her curse. It had covered her escape from the Wright mansion 3 nights ago, but it had also slowed her flight, giving Nathaniel's men time to organize their pursuit. Now, as she navigated the narrow ledge trail that wound through Devil's Backbone, she could hear them gaining ground despite the treacherous conditions. There, the voice of Marcus Steele, her husband's chief enforcer, cut through the thunder. "She's heading for Widow's Gorge. Cut her off at the North Passage." Cassandra's blood turned to ice. Steele knew these canyons as well as she did, perhaps better. The man had been hunting Apache and Army deserters through this maze of red rock for years, first as a cavalry captain, now as Nathaniel's private Army commander. If he was directing the hunt personally, it meant her husband wanted her back badly enough to risk his most valuable asset. She had maybe 10 minutes before they closed the trap. Her mare's labored breathing told her the animal couldn't take much more. The poor beast had been running for 3 days on little food and less rest, driven by the same desperate will to survive that kept Cassandra upright in the saddle despite her injuries. They had been through hell together, woman and horse, and she wouldn't abandon her faithful companion now. But as the trail narrowed to barely 2 feet wide with a 100-foot drop yawning on her right and sheer cliff face on her left, Cassandra realized with crystal clarity that they weren't going to make it out of this canyon alive. Not both of them. The thought had barely formed when the first rifle shot cracked above the storm, the bullet chipping stone just inches from her head. They'd found the range. "Cassandra!" Steele's voice boomed from somewhere behind her. "Mrs. Wright, your husband wants you home safe. Surrender now, and we'll see you get the medical attention you need." The bastard made it sound like a rescue mission, as if Nathaniel hadn't been the one to break her ribs in the first place, hadn't beaten her unconscious when she'd confronted him about the photographs she'd found hidden in his study. As if the medical attention wouldn't involve a convenient overdose of laudanum or a tragic accident on the stairs. Another shot rang out closer this time. Her mare shied violently, hooves skittering on the wet rock. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge of eternity before Cassandra hauled them back from the brink with strength born of pure desperation. "Easy, girl," she whispered, stroking the horse's neck with her free hand. "Just a little further. We can make it to the old mining trail, and then—" The words died in her throat as she rounded the next bend and saw them. 3 riders blocked the narrow trail ahead, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, rain streaming from their slickers. They sat their horses with the casual confidence of men who knew their quarry was trapped. Behind her, Steele's party was closing fast. To her right, certain death in the rocky gorge below. To her left, unclimbable stone walls. Cassandra Wright, who had once been the toast of Denver society, who had married into railroad money and territorial politics, who had never fired a gun in anger or feared for her life, found herself in a position that would have broken most women of her upbringing. Instead, it revealed the steel in her spine that her genteel education had never quite managed to bend. She drew the Colt .45 from her husband's holster, the same gun he'd tried to use on her when she'd threatened to expose his crimes, and spurred her exhausted horse directly at the 3 men blocking her path. The lead rider's eyes widened in shock as this bleeding, desperate woman came charging at them through the storm like some avenging angel. His hand went to his own weapon, but Cassandra was already firing the heavy revolver bucking in her grip as she triggered shot after shot. She wasn't trying to kill them, despite everything. She wasn't a murderer like her husband. But she was damn well going to clear a path or die trying. Her first shot went wide, spanging off the cliff face. The second shattered the lead rider's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a scream that was lost in the thunder. The third punched through another man's hat, sending him diving for cover behind his horse. "Jesus Christ," someone shouted. "The woman's lost her mind." Maybe she had. Maybe that was what it took to survive when the whole world wanted you dead or silent. Cassandra felt a wild, fierce joy rise in her chest as her mare leaped over the fallen rider's horse hooves, striking sparks from the stone as they landed hard on the far side of the ambush. Freedom stretched ahead of her 50 yards of narrow trail before it opened into the wider canyon where she might find sanctuary in the old Comanche caves. She leaned low over her horse's neck, feeling the wind whip her long dark hair loose from its pins. Feeling more alive than she had in years of suffocating marriage to a man who collected people like he collected railroad cars. That was when the rifle bullet took her mare in the chest. The world turned sideways as the brave animal went down, her heart pierced by a marksman's shot from the pursuing party. Cassandra had a moment of weightless terror before she hit the stone trail hard, her already broken ribs screaming in protest as she rolled and tumbled toward the cliff edge. Her desperate fingers found a handhold on a jutting piece of sandstone just as her legs went over the side. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she hung suspended between earth and sky, the storm-dark gorge yawning beneath her boots. The saddlebags with their precious evidence dangled from her shoulder by a single strap, their weight threatening to drag her down into the abyss. "Well, well," came a familiar voice from above, "if it isn't the Wright family's wayward daughter-in-law." Captain Marcus Steele peered down at her from the trail, his scarred face split by a cold smile. Behind him, 2 more riders had arrived, their weapons trained on her position. The men she'd shot were being helped to their feet, cursing and bleeding, but very much alive. "Quite the performance, Mrs. Wright." Steele continued, his voice conversational, despite the storm raging around them. "Your husband will be so pleased to know you've developed such spirit. He's been worried sick about your mental condition since you disappeared." "My mental condition," Cassandra gasped, fighting to maintain her grip on the slick stone. "Is that what he's calling it now?" "Hysteria brought on by the trauma of witnessing Apache raids," Steele said smoothly. "Tragic, really. Makes a woman see things that aren't there, imagine conspiracies where none exist. But don't worry, Nathaniel has found an excellent sanitarium back east, very discreet, very secure." The implication was clear. They would lock her away, where her accusations could be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. The evidence in her saddlebags would disappear, the murdered Apache families would be forgotten, and Nathaniel Wright would continue his bloody expansion of the railroad empire. "You won't get away with this," she said, though even she could hear how weak the words sounded coming from a woman hanging by her fingertips over a cliff. "My dear Mrs. Wright." Steele chuckled. "We already have." He started to extend his hand toward her, whether to help or to push her to her death, Cassandra would never know. Because at that moment the storm that had been her enemy became her salvation. Lightning struck the iron deposits in the cliff face directly above Steele's position. The bolt of electricity turning the night white as noon and sending a cascade of fractured stone raining down on the bounty hunters. Steele's horse reared in terror, its hooves flailing as it fought to escape the falling rocks. The captain, caught off guard, was thrown from his saddle and went sprawling across the narrow trail. In the chaos that followed, Cassandra saw her chance. Using the last of her strength, she hauled herself up onto the ledge just as another section of the cliff face came loose. The massive boulder, easily the size of a stagecoach, broke free with a grinding roar that drowned out even the thunder. She had perhaps 3 seconds to live, but sometimes 3 seconds was enough. The boulder struck the trail where Steele's men had been standing, pulverizing the stone pathway and sending an avalanche of debris tumbling into the gorge below. When the dust and smoke cleared, the narrow ledge trail had been completely obliterated, leaving a gap of 20 feet between Cassandra's position and where the bounty hunters stood on the far side. "Son of a bitch!" Steele roared, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "She's trapped herself." And she had. The rockslide had bought her time, but it had also cut off her only escape route. She was alone on a tiny ledge of stone, wounded and exhausted, with nowhere left to run. Steele wiped the blood from his eyes and studied her position with the calculating gaze of a man who had hunted human prey across half the Southwest. "No way down, no way across," he called to her. "You can sit there until you starve, or you can toss me those saddlebags and we'll throw you a rope." Cassandra looked at the leather bags containing the evidence of her husband's crimes. Photographs of Apache children who would never grow up, land deeds signed in blood rather than ink, letters that revealed the conspiracy reaching all the way to Washington. If she surrendered them, justice would die with them. But if she didn't, she would die here on this ledge, and the evidence would die with her anyway. She was still contemplating her impossible choice when she heard the voice. Ma'am, can you hear me?" The words came from below, carried on the wind that howled through the canyon. Cassandra leaned forward carefully and peered over the edge of her stone perch. There, impossibly, a man was climbing up the cliff face toward her. He moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in these mountains, finding handholds where none should exist. "Don't look down," the voice called again, closer now. "And whatever you do, don't let go." In the brief lull between lightning strikes, she caught a glimpse of her unlikely rescuer. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and lean-dressed in weather-stained buckskins and a worn cavalry hat. A rifle was slung across his back and a Colt Peacemaker rode low on his hip. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could see the determined set of his jaw as he climbed. "Who are you?" she called down. "Jake Morrison," came the reply. "And right now, I'm the only friend you've got." On the far side of the gap, Steele had spotted the newcomer. "Morrison," he shouted, his voice carrying a note of surprised recognition. "Jake Morrison, you son of a bitch, I should have known you'd turn up like a bad penny." The climbing man. Morrison paused in his ascent and looked across the chasm. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grudges and older pain. "Hello, Marcus. Still hunting women and children for railroad money, I see." "This doesn't concern you, Jake," Steele warned. "Ride away now, and we'll call it even for what happened at Bitter Creek." "Bitter Creek?" Morrison's voice went deadly quiet. "You think we're even for Bitter Creek?" Cassandra didn't understand the reference, but she could feel the hatred radiating between the two men like heat from a forge. Whatever history they shared, it was written in blood and sealed with betrayal. "The woman is wanted for theft and destruction of property," Steele continued. "There's a federal warrant. There's a federal load of horseshit." Morrison cut him off. "I've seen Wright's handiwork before. The real question is, how many pieces of silver did it take to buy your conscience this time?" Steele's face darkened. "You always were too smart for your own good, Jake. It's going to get you killed." "Men like you have been trying to kill me for 10 years, Marcus. I'm still here." Morrison resumed his climb, his powerful hands finding purchase on the storm-slick stone. Below him, the gorge dropped away into darkness, but he moved without fear or hesitation. 20 feet, 15, 10. "Ma'am," he called up to Cassandra, "when I reach you, we're going to have to move fast. Can you climb?" She looked down at him, this stranger who had appeared out of the storm like something from a dime novel. "With broken ribs? In this weather, are you insane?" A flash of lightning illuminated his face for the first time, revealing features that were weathered, but not old scarred, but not cruel. His eyes, she noticed, were the color of winter sky, pale blue and utterly fearless. "Probably," he admitted with what might have been a grin. "But right now, crazy is all you've got." Above them, Steele was shouting orders to his men. "Rodriguez, take 3 men and circle around to the South Passage. If they make it down from there, I want them cut off before they reach the desert. Mitchell, you and Carson find a way across this gap." Morrison's hand closed around Cassandra's ankle with surprising gentleness. "Time to go, ma'am. Hope you're not afraid of heights." "After the last 3 days," she gasped, "I'm not afraid of anything anymore." "Good," Morrison said, pulling himself up onto the ledge beside her. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered face that came from years under the southwestern sun. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who worked with rope and steel. "What's your name?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Steele's position across the gap. "Cassandra. Cassandra Wright." Something shifted in his expression at the name. Wright, as in Nathaniel Wright. The railroad baron? My husband, she said, and watched his face go hard as stone. Your husband, Morrison repeated slowly, is the man who ordered the massacre at Apache Springs 6 months ago, killed 47 people including women and children to clear the land for his railroad. Does that sound like the man you married? The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd suspected Nathaniel was involved in driving the Apache from their traditional lands, but a massacre, women and children. I have evidence, she whispered, clutching the saddlebags tighter. Photographs, documents, proof of what he's done. Morrison studied her face in the intermittent lightning, searching for deception and finding only truth. Then we need to get you somewhere safe. Hold on tight. This is going to hurt. He was right about that. The descent down the cliff face was a nightmare of pain and terror that pushed Cassandra's already damaged body to its absolute limits. Morrison had rigged a rope around her waist, taking most of her weight as they rappelled down the sheer stone wall. But every jarring impact against the rock sent fresh agony through her broken ribs. Behind them, Steele's frustrated curses echoed off the canyon walls as he realized his quarry was escaping. The bounty hunters would have to backtrack miles to find another way down, giving Morrison and Cassandra precious time to reach safety, if they could survive the descent. Halfway down the cliff, disaster struck. A section of rope weakened by the constant abrasion against the sharp stone began to fray. Morrison saw it happening and made an instant decision that probably saved both their lives. "Swing toward me," he shouted over the wind. "Now!" Cassandra didn't hesitate. She kicked off from the cliff face with her good leg, pendulum swinging across the gap. Just as the rope snapped, Morrison caught her with one arm, his own line groaning under their combined weight. For a terrifying moment, they spun in the wind, suspended over the abyss by a single strand of hemp. Then Morrison's feet found a narrow ledge and they were no longer falling. That was close, he muttered, blood from a new cut on his cheek mixing with the rain. Too close. Cassandra agreed, though she was amazed to find herself almost smiling. When was the last time she'd felt this alive, this free? Even hanging from a rope in a thunderstorm with broken ribs, she felt more herself than she had in years of playing the dutiful railroad wife. They completed the descent without further incident, though. By the time they reached the canyon floor, Cassandra was barely conscious from pain and exhaustion. Morrison caught her as she collapsed, his strong arms surprisingly gentle as he lifted her against his chest. "Easy," he murmured. "You've done the hard part. Now, let me do mine." Through the haze of agony, she became aware that he was carrying her through the storm toward some kind of shelter. The world blurred past in impressions, towering rock walls, the smell of sage and wet earth, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. When she next opened her eyes, she was lying on a bedroll inside what appeared to be a cave. A small fire crackled nearby, its smoke drawn up through some natural chimney in the rock ceiling. Her ribs had been properly bound with clean bandages, and someone had covered her with a thick wool blanket. Morrison sat nearby, cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with premature gray, and had shed his wet buckskin jacket. In the firelight, the scar on his face looked like it had been made by a saber, the kind of wound a cavalry officer might take in close combat. "Welcome back," he said without looking up from his weapon. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a cattle drive," she admitted, testing her breathing. The tight bandages helped, but every breath was still an effort. "Where are we?" "Ancient Anasazi cave system," Morrison replied, running an oiled cloth down the rifle barrel. "Discovered it during the war when I was scouting for General Carson. Steele and his boys will never find us here, even if they had tracking dogs." "You know Steele?" It wasn't a question, and Morrison didn't treat it like one. "Served under him for 3 years in the 3rd Cavalry. He was a good officer once, before the railroad money corrupted him. Before he decided that killing Indians for profit was more profitable than protecting settlers from raiders." "What happened at Bitter Creek?" Cassandra asked quietly. Morrison's hands stilled on his rifle. For a long moment, the only sound in the cave was the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder outside. "Bitter Creek was a peaceful Apache settlement," he said finally. "About 40 families, mostly women, children, and old men. The warriors were away on a hunting expedition. Steele got orders supposedly from the territorial governor to relocate them to the reservation, but when we arrived..." He trailed off, his jaw working silently as he fought with memories that clearly still had the power to wound. "When we arrived, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. There were already dead bodies in the camp, men Steele had sent ahead to secure the area. The Apache families were terrified, confused. They didn't understand why soldiers were pointing guns at them when they'd been living peacefully for years. Cassandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. "What did you do?" "I tried to stop it," Morrison said simply. "When Steele gave the order to open fire, I countermanded it, told the men to stand down. For a moment, I thought reason might prevail. But it didn't. Steele pulled his sidearm and shot an Apache woman who was holding her baby, shot her in the back as she tried to run, said she was resisting relocation. Then he ordered the men to fire and—" Morrison's voice broke slightly. "And they did, because soldiers follow orders even when those orders are monstrous." Cassandra closed her eyes, seeing in her mind the photographs hidden in her saddlebags. Images of Apache families who would never laugh or cry or hope again, all for the sake of railroad expansion and profit margins. "I managed to save a few," Morrison continued. "Got them out during the confusion. But most of them died that day at Bitter Creek, 43 people including my—" He stopped abruptly, but Cassandra caught the catch in his voice. "Your what?" Morrison was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were weighted with a grief that time had not lessened. "My wife, Ayanna, she was teaching the Apache children to read English, trying to help them understand the changing world. We'd been married for 2 years. She was—" He swallowed hard. "She was carrying our child." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. "Steele killed your family." "Not directly, but he gave the orders. And when I tried to stop him, when I drew my weapon on my commanding officer to protect innocent lives, he had me arrested for mutiny. Spent 6 months in military prison while he wrote his report painting me as an Indian lover who'd lost his mind to savage influence." Morrison set down his rifle and stared into the fire, his pale eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "By the time I got out, the survivors of Bitter Creek had scattered to the winds. Ayanna's body had been burned with the others in a mass grave. No marker, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that she'd ever existed." Cassandra felt tears burning her own eyes. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have everything stripped away by the greed and cruelty of powerful men. No wonder he'd risked his life to save her from Steele's bounty hunters. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Morrison glanced at her, and for a moment his weathered features softened. "What's done is done. But your evidence, the photographs and documents in those bags that could finally bring some justice for what happened, not just at Bitter Creek, but at all the other places where Wright's money bought Apache blood." Cassandra struggled to sit up, ignoring the fresh spears of pain through her chest. "Then we have to get it to someone who can act on it, a federal judge or a territorial marshal who isn't in Wright's pocket." "Easier said than done," Morrison replied grimly. "Your husband has connections reaching all the way to Washington. Half the territorial government is either bought or intimidated, and now that you've escaped with evidence of his crimes, he'll move heaven and earth to silence you permanently." "Then, what do you suggest?" Morrison considered the question, his fingers drumming against his knee as he thought. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant as the weather system moved east toward the plains. "There's a man," he said finally. "Colonel James Harper, retired cavalry. He's been investigating railroad corruption for the federal government, working directly for the Secretary of War. If anyone has the authority and the integrity to act on your evidence, it's him." "Where is he?" "Santa Fe, last I heard. But that's 3 days hard riding from here, assuming we can avoid Steele's manhunt. And assuming Harper is still alive, men who investigate Wright have a tendency to suffer fatal accidents." Cassandra felt a spark of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. "Will you take me to him?" Morrison studied her face in the firelight, and she could see him weighing the risks. Taking her to Santa Fe would mean abandoning his isolated ranch, making himself a target for Wright's enforcers, possibly dying for a cause that wasn't technically his fight. But then his eyes hardened with resolve, and she realized he'd already made his decision the moment he'd started climbing that cliff to reach her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll take you to Santa Fe. But first you need to understand what you're asking. Wright won't just send bounty hunters after us. He'll mobilize his private army, bribe federal marshals, maybe even call in favors with the territorial cavalry. We'll be running a gauntlet across 300 miles of desert and mountain with enemies waiting around every bend." "I understand," Cassandra said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "But what's the alternative? Let him continue murdering innocent families for railroad profits. Let Steele and men like him turn the army into a private enforcement wing for corporate interests." Morrison nodded slowly. "You're not wrong, and you've got more backbone than most men I've served with. But backbone won't stop bullets, and Wright has plenty of those to spend." As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the canyon outside their cave. Morrison was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the cave mouth with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent years dodging Apache arrows and Confederate bullets. "Steele," Cassandra whispered. Morrison peered out into the storm-lashed darkness, his eyes scanning the canyon walls for signs of the enemy. Maybe, or it could be Apache raiders taking advantage of the storm to settle old scores. Either way, we need to move. He began gathering their supplies with quick efficiency, stuffing everything into a pair of saddlebags while Cassandra struggled to her feet. The world swayed dangerously as she stood, her broken ribs screaming in protest, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to remain upright. "Can you ride?" Morrison asked, shouldering his pack. "Do I have a choice?" "Not if you want to live through the night." More gunfire echoed from somewhere in the maze of canyons, closer this time, and sustained enough to suggest a running battle rather than a brief skirmish. Morrison cursed under his breath as he helped Cassandra toward the cave entrance. "That's not Steele," he said grimly. "That's Army, Springfield Rifles by the sound of it, which means your husband has called in federal troops to hunt you down." The implications hit Cassandra like a cold slap. If Nathaniel had convinced the military to join the manhunt, then he'd probably spun some story about her being a dangerous fugitive or a spy for foreign interests. The full weight of the United States government would be brought to bear against them. "How is that possible?" she gasped as Morrison led her along a narrow ledge toward where he'd apparently hidden horses. "Money," Morrison replied tersely, "and blackmail. Wright's been documenting his bribes and backroom deals for years, keeping records on everyone he's corrupted. If federal officials don't cooperate with his version of events, he can destroy their careers with a few strategically placed documents." They reached a hidden corral where two horses waited, Morrison's own mount, a sturdy bay gelding, and a smaller pinto mare that looked built for speed rather than endurance. Morrison helped Cassandra into the mare's saddle, his hands gentle but urgent as he adjusted her stirrups. "This is Esperanza," he said, patting the pinto's neck. "She's fast, smart, and sure-footed. If we get separated, give her her head and she'll take you to water." "Where are we going?" Morrison swung into his own saddle, his movements quick and sure despite the darkness. "North toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. There are caves up there where we can rest and plan our next move. But first, we have to get out of these canyons without running into whoever's doing the shooting." As if in response to his words, the gunfire erupted again, much closer now. In the brief lull that followed, they could hear voices shouting orders in English, definitely Army and definitely hunting someone with systematic thoroughness. Morrison guided his horse toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the canyon system, away from the sounds of combat. Cassandra followed, trying to ignore the jolting pain in her ribs as her mount picked its way over the rocky ground. They had ridden perhaps a mile when Morrison suddenly reined in, his hand going to his rifle. Ahead of them, blocking the trail, stood a line of blue-uniformed cavalry troopers, their carbines trained on the two riders. "Halt!" commanded the sergeant in charge. "Dismount and identify yourselves." Morrison's hand moved toward his Colt, but stopped when he saw the hopelessness of their situation. 12 soldiers with repeating rifles against 2 exhausted fugitives. It wouldn't even be a fight. "Easy there, boys," Morrison called out, his voice carefully neutral. "Just travelers trying to get out of the storm." The sergeant stepped forward, his weathered face suspicious in the flickering light of a torch held by one of his men. "This area is under military jurisdiction, mister. We're looking for a dangerous fugitive, a woman wanted for theft and assault. You seen anyone matching that description?" Cassandra felt her heart hammering against her broken ribs. If they were caught now, all her suffering would be for nothing. The evidence of Nathaniel's crimes would disappear, the murdered Apache families would never receive justice, and she would vanish into whatever sanitarium her husband had prepared for inconvenient wives. But then Morrison did something that shocked her to her core. "Matter of fact, Sergeant," he said conversationally. I did see a woman riding hell-bent for leather about an hour ago, headed east toward Piedras Verdes. Looked like she was running from something. The sergeant's eyes sharpened with interest. You get a good look at her. Dark hair, fancy dress, all torn up, riding a chestnut mare. Woman looked half dead from exhaustion. Morrison's description was accurate enough to be convincing while sending the soldiers in completely the wrong direction. That's her, the sergeant said with satisfaction. Mrs. Nathaniel Wright wanted for theft of railroad property and assault on a federal marshal. There's a $1,000 reward for her capture. $1,000? Morrison whistled low. Hell, Sergeant, if I'd known that, I might have tried to stop her myself. The soldiers laughed, and Cassandra saw the tension ease slightly. Morrison had just bought them passage with a lie so smooth it sounded like gospel truth. You boys be careful out there, Morrison continued. That woman looked desperate enough to shoot first and ask questions later. And there's Apache sign all through these canyons. Fresh tracks, probably war parties taking advantage of the storm. The sergeant nodded grimly. Appreciate the warning, mister. You folks best get clear of this area before dawn. Things are likely to get hot around here. Already planning on it, Morrison assured him. Good hunting, boys. The soldiers parted to let them pass, several of the troopers touching their hat brims in casual salute. Cassandra kept her head down and her face hidden beneath the brim of Morrison's spare hat, praying that none of them would look too closely at the man riding beside their helpful informant. They rode past the military patrol without incident, but Cassandra didn't allow herself to breathe normally until they were well out of earshot. Only then did she turn to Morrison with wonder and gratitude shining in her eyes. That was incredible, she whispered. How did you learn a long time ago that sometimes the truth gets you killed? Morrison replied quietly. And sometimes a lie saves lives. Those boys were just following orders. No point in getting them shot over Wright's corruption. They rode in silence for another hour, climbing steadily into the higher reaches of the canyon system. The storm was finally breaking up patches of star-filled skyite, visible between the racing clouds. In the distance, Cassandra could see the first faint glow of dawn touching the eastern peaks. She was beginning to think they might actually escape when Morrison suddenly pulled up short, his body going rigid with tension. What is it? She whispered, following his gaze. There, silhouetted against the lightning sky on a ridge above them, sat a lone horseman. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about the figure's posture, something that made Cassandra's blood run cold. Steele, Morrison said grimly. Son of a bitch must have circled around while we were dealing with the patrol. He's been tracking us. As if aware that he'd been spotted, the distant figure raised something to his lips, a brass horn that sent a clear carrying note echoing through the canyons. An answering call came from behind them, then another from the south. How many men does he have? Cassandra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Morrison was already turning his horse toward the only remaining escape route, a narrow defile that led up into the mountains proper. Too many, he said tersely, and they know these canyons almost as well as I do. The horn calls were multiplying now, creating a web of sound that told the story of a carefully coordinated hunt. Steele had been using the storm and the military patrol as cover, positioning his men to close off every escape route except the one he wanted his quarry to take. It's a trap, Cassandra realized. Of course it's a trap, Morrison agreed, spurring his horse into a gallop as the first rifle shots began echoing off the canyon walls. But sometimes the only way out of a trap is through it. They rode hard up the treacherous mountain trail, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone as they climbed. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, the thunder of multiple horses, the shouts of men who could taste victory. Cassandra clung to her saddle horn as her mare scrambled up slopes that would have challenged a mountain goat. Every jarring step sent fresh agony through her broken ribs, but she gritted her teeth and held on. Morrison had risked everything to save her. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. The trail narrowed to barely 4 feet wide as they approached a natural stone bridge spanning a deep chasm. On the far side lay the relative safety of the high peaks where Steele's superior numbers would count for less in the broken terrain. They were halfway across when the first bullet whined past Cassandra's ear. Go, go, go! Morrison shouted, drawing his Colt and returning fire even as he rode. His shots were hurried but accurate, forcing the pursuing gunman to take cover rather than aiming carefully. Cassandra's mare leaped the last 10 feet to solid ground just as Morrison's gelding stumbled. For a heart-stopping moment, both horse and rider teetered on the edge of the chasm. Then Morrison threw himself clear, landing hard on the stone bridge as his faithful mount tumbled into the darkness below. "Jake!" Cassandra screamed, wheeling her horse around. Morrison rolled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead but otherwise intact. "Keep going!" he yelled, even as he limped toward her position. "Don't wait for me!" But Cassandra Wright, who had been raised to be a proper lady, who had been taught that women should depend on men for protection, made a decision that would have shocked her finishing school instructors. She turned her horse back toward the bridge. "Take my hand," she called, extending her arm toward Morrison, even as bullets chipped stone around them. Morrison didn't hesitate. He grabbed her outstretched hand and swung up behind her just as Steele's men reached the far end of the bridge. The pinto mare, carrying double weight, struggled gamely up the steep slope beyond the chasm. "You should have left me," Morrison said in her ear, his arms encircling her waist to help her stay in the saddle. "Like you left me hanging from that cliff," she replied, surprising herself with a laugh. "I don't think so." Behind them, Steele's furious curses echoed across the chasm. The bridge was too narrow for more than one horse at a time, and Morrison's accurate rifle fire had discouraged any heroic charges. The bounty hunters would have to find another way around, buying the fugitives precious time to reach the high country. But as they crested the ridge and looked back, Cassandra saw something that chilled her to the bone. More riders were approaching from the east, a full cavalry troop in dress blue uniforms moving with the systematic precision of a military operation. "Federal marshals," Morrison said grimly, following her gaze. "Wright's called in every favor he has." The net was closing around them, and there was nowhere left to run. The abandoned silver mine shaft yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its timber supports rotted with age and desert wind. Jake Morrison studied the entrance with the calculating gaze of a man who'd learned that survival often meant choosing between dangerous options and deadly ones. "How deep does it go?" Cassandra Wright asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as she peered into the darkness beyond the weathered planks. "Deep enough to hide us," Morrison replied, checking the loads in his Colt for the third time in 10 minutes. "Maybe deep enough to die in if we're unlucky." Behind them, the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder. They'd been running for 6 hours since escaping Steele's trap at the stone bridge, pushing their exhausted pinto mare through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. But the federal marshals were closing in their superior numbers, and fresh horses slowly eating away at the fugitives' lead. Cassandra shifted in the saddle, trying to find a position that didn't send lightning bolts of pain through her broken ribs. The binding Morrison had applied was holding, but every jarring step of their desperate flight had taken its toll. She could taste blood in her mouth now, and her vision occasionally blurred at the edges. "There has to be another way," she said, though even she could hear the desperation in her voice. Morrison swung down from behind her, his weathered face grim in the pre-dawn light. "Ma'am, I've been running from various folks trying to kill me for the better part of 10 years. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you hide, and sometimes you trust to luck in the darkness. Right now, that mine shaft is the best option we've got." He helped her dismount, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man who'd spent the night exchanging gunfire with bounty hunters. Cassandra stumbled as her feet hit the ground, and Morrison's strong arms caught her before she could fall. "Easy there," he murmured, and for a moment they were standing closer than propriety would normally allow. Cassandra found herself looking up into his pale blue eyes, seeing not just the weathered cavalry scout, but something deeper, a kindness that hadn't been killed by years of violence and loss. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning more than just his help with dismounting. Morrison's gaze held hers for a heartbeat longer before he stepped back, clearing his throat. "We need to get that horse hidden. Sound carries a long way in these mountains." He led the pinto mare around to the back of the mine headframe, where a collapsed section of roof had created a natural shelter. The animal was exhausted, her sides heaving from the punishing pace, but she nuzzled Morrison's hand with obvious affection. "You've done good, girl," he said softly, checking her hooves for stones. "Rest now. We'll need you again, come nightfall." Cassandra watched him tend to the horse with practiced efficiency, noting the way his hands moved with unconscious competence. Everything about Jake Morrison suggested a man who'd learned to survive in a harsh world through skill rather than luck, violence rather than politics. "How long were you in the cavalry?" she asked as they gathered their meager supplies and prepared to descend into the mine. 8 years, Morrison replied, shouldering his rifle. Enlisted when I was 18, fresh off a hardscrabble farm in Kansas. Thought I was going to see adventure, maybe make something of myself. His mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. Got more adventure than I bargained for. He lit a torch from their dwindling supply and led the way into the mine shaft. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for two people walking side by side, and the ceiling was low enough that Morrison had to duck his head. The air smelled of dampness and long-dead dreams. "What made you leave?" Cassandra asked, following close behind him. She was grateful for the conversation. It helped distract her from the oppressive darkness and the growing pain in her chest. Morrison was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice echoed strangely in the confines of the tunnel. "I told you about Bitter Creek, about Ayanna." He paused, holding the torch higher to illuminate a fork in the passage ahead. "What I didn't tell you is that she wasn't just my wife. She was the daughter of Chief Running Bear, one of the most respected Apache leaders in the territory." Cassandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mine's damp air. "You married an Apache woman. Her father and I had become friends during a peace negotiation the year before. He saw that I was different from most soldiers, that I didn't see his people as savages to be exterminated. When Ayanna and I fell in love, he gave us his blessing." Morrison's voice softened with memory. The ceremony was beautiful. Both Apache and Christian traditions witnessed by her tribe and a few soldiers I trusted. They took the left fork, descending deeper into the mountain. The walls here were scored with pick marks from long-dead miners, and occasionally they passed rusted equipment abandoned when the silver played out. "But when word of the marriage reached my superiors," Morrison continued, "it changed everything. Suddenly I was suspected of divided loyalties. Every report I filed about Apache movements was questioned. Other officers stopped trusting me with sensitive information." "Because you married for love instead of politics," Cassandra said quietly. "Because I married an Indian," Morrison corrected with bitter honesty. "In their minds, that made me a traitor to my own race. When Steele got his orders to relocate the Apache at Bitter Creek, I think part of him saw it as a chance to solve the problem of Jake Morrison once and for all." The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, clearly a natural cave that the miners had expanded. Morrison held his torch high, revealing rock walls that sparkled with traces of silver ore. At the far end, an underground stream trickled through a crevice, providing fresh water. "This'll do," Morrison said, setting the torch in a crevice in the wall. "We can rest here until nightfall, then decide our next move." Cassandra sank gratefully onto a flat boulder that served as a natural bench. The constant pain in her ribs was exhausting, but more than that, she was beginning to feel the weight of what they were up against. Her husband's reach seemed to extend everywhere: federal marshals, cavalry troops, bounty hunters. How could two people, one of them injured, hope to prevail against such overwhelming force? "Jake," she said hesitantly, "what if we can't make it to Santa Fe? What if Colonel Harper can't help us? What if—" "Hey." Morrison's voice was firm but kind as he knelt beside her boulder. "We'll cross those bridges when we come to them. Right now we're alive, we're free, and you still have the evidence that can bring your husband to justice. That's more than we had 12 hours ago." Cassandra looked down at the leather saddlebags that contained the photographs and documents she'd stolen from Nathaniel's study. The images were burned into her memory: Apache families lying motionless in the dust, their children's toys scattered among the bodies, women who would never again sing lullabies, men who would never again teach their sons to hunt. "There are so many of them," she whispered. "In the photographs, whole families, and the documents show it wasn't just Bitter Creek. There were other places, other massacres, all to clear land for the railroad." Morrison's jaw tightened. "How many other places?" Cassandra opened one of the saddlebags with trembling fingers and withdrew a leather portfolio. Inside were not just photographs, but maps marked with red X's, correspondence between Nathaniel and territorial officials, and financial records showing payments to various military units. Apache Springs, like you mentioned, Bitter Creek, Willow Canyon, Red Rock Mesa. She read from a list in her husband's handwriting. 12 locations in total over the past 2 years. The documents estimate nearly 400 native casualties. 400? Morrison repeated, his voice hollow with shock. Jesus Christ, he didn't just commit murder, he committed genocide. The enormity of it settled over them like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just about corruption or illegal land grabs. Nathaniel Wright had orchestrated the systematic extermination of entire Apache communities, all to advance his railroad empire. "There's more," Cassandra said, her voice barely audible. "Financial records showing payments to federal judges, territorial governors, even congressmen. Your husband's corruption reaches all the way to Washington." Morrison studied the documents by torchlight, his face growing grimmer with each page. "This explains how he's been able to mobilize federal troops so quickly. Half the territorial government is in his pocket." A distant sound made them both freeze, the clatter of hooves on stone echoing down from the mine entrance. Morrison was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to where he could watch the tunnel mouth. "How many?" Cassandra whispered, hastily repacking the documents. Morrison listened intently to the sounds from above. "Hard to say. At least 6 riders, maybe more. They're being cautious, that's good. Means they're not sure we're down here." The hoofbeats circled the mine entrance for several minutes before stopping. Then came the sound of men dismounting, followed by voices echoing down the shaft. "Fresh tracks lead right to the mine," someone called. Cassandra recognized the voice with a chill. Captain Marcus Steele himself had caught up to them. "Could be a trap," another voice warned. "Morrison's too smart to back himself into a hole like this, unless he's got an ace up his sleeve." "Morrison's also been riding double with a wounded woman for 6 hours," Steele replied coldly. "He's tired, she's hurt, and they're running out of options. Rodriguez, take 3 men and start working your way down. Careful now, I want them alive if possible." Morrison cursed under his breath and moved to extinguish the torch, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the blackness, Cassandra felt his hand find hers, warm and reassuring. "Follow the stream," he whispered directly into her ear. "It has to lead somewhere. I'll hold them off as long as I can." "No," Cassandra said fiercely, gripping his hand tighter. "We stay together. I won't leave you to face them alone." "Ma'am Cassandra, you don't understand. Those men won't hesitate to kill me, but they need you alive. Your husband wants to deal with you personally. If you surrender..." "If I surrender, I disappear into whatever sanitarium Nathaniel has prepared, and all those Apache families died for nothing." Cassandra's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I'd rather die free than live as his prisoner." Morrison was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke there was something like admiration in his voice. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most stubborn." "Probably both," Cassandra admitted with a shaky laugh. The sounds of approaching boots echoed down the tunnel, accompanied by the flicker of torchlight. Morrison checked his weapons one final time, rifle loaded, Colt ready, knife sharp. Not much against 6 armed men, but it would have to do. "This way," he whispered, guiding Cassandra toward the underground stream. "Stay low, stay quiet, and if shooting starts, keep moving, no matter what." They followed the narrow watercourse deeper into the mountain, feeling their way along the slick rock walls. Behind them, the voices of Steele's men grew louder as they entered the main chamber. "Torch burns indicate recent occupation," one of them reported, "but no sign of the fugitives." "Check every passage," Steele ordered. "They're down here somewhere, and remember the woman is worth more alive than dead, but Morrison is expendable." The stream led them through a series of increasingly narrow passages, some barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cassandra's broken ribs screamed in protest as she contorted her body to fit through the tight spaces, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into another cave, this one lit by filtered sunlight from somewhere above. Morrison studied the ceiling, noting the cracks that allowed daylight to penetrate. "Sinkhole," he said quietly. "We might be able to climb out if..." The sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels behind them, followed by shouts and the pounding of running feet. Someone had found their trail. Morrison grabbed Cassandra's hand and pulled her toward the base of the sinkhole. "Up," he said urgently. "Fast as you can." The climb was a nightmare. The walls of the sinkhole were loose shale and crumbling limestone, offering precious little in the way of handholds. Cassandra's injured ribs made every upward movement agony, but Morrison climbed beside her, occasionally boosting her when her strength failed. They were halfway to the surface when the first of Steele's men entered the cave below. Shouts of discovery echoed up the shaft, followed immediately by rifle fire. Bullets whined off the rock wall, sending chips of stone raining down on the climbing fugitives. Morrison drew his Colt and returned fire, one-handed, his shots echoing like thunder in the confined space. One of Steele's men cried out and fell, but the others pressed forward, using the cave walls for cover. "Keep climbing," Morrison shouted to Cassandra. "Don't look back." With a final desperate effort, Cassandra hauled herself over the lip of the sinkhole and collapsed onto solid ground. They were on a rocky plateau, surrounded by pine trees with mountains stretching away in all directions. In the distance, she could see smoke from what might be a settlement. Morrison emerged from the sinkhole just as another volley of shots rang out below. One bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he managed to keep his grip on the edge. "Jake!" Cassandra grabbed his uninjured arm and helped pull him to safety. "I'm all right," he gasped, though blood was already soaking through his shirt. "Flesh wound. We need to keep moving." Behind them, angry voices echoed from the sinkhole as Steele's men began their own climb to the surface. The fugitives had perhaps a 5-minute head start before the pursuit resumed. Morrison led the way through the pine forest, moving with the silent efficiency of a man who'd spent years as an army scout. Despite his wound, he maintained a punishing pace, using game trails and rocky ground to hide their tracks. "Where are we going?" Cassandra asked, struggling to keep up. "I saw smoke from the ridge," Morrison replied, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. "Might be a settlement or at least a place to find horses." They crested a small rise and saw a cluster of adobe buildings nestled in a valley below. But this wasn't the peaceful frontier town Cassandra had hoped for. Even from a distance, she could see armed men patrolling the perimeter, and the black smoke rising from several chimneys suggested industry rather than simple homesteading. "What is that place?" she asked. Morrison studied the layout with professional interest, noting the defensive positions and the quality of the horses in the corral. "Mining camp, most likely. Or," his expression darkened, "or a staging area for railroad construction crews." The implications hit Cassandra like a cold slap. If this was one of Nathaniel's operations, they were walking directly into enemy territory. But what choice did they have? Behind them, Steele's men would emerge from the mine at any moment, and in their current condition, they couldn't outrun mounted pursuit much longer. "We need horses," Morrison said grimly, "and medical supplies. That means going down there whether it's friendly or not." "And if it's one of my husband's camps," Morrison checked his weapons, noting that he was down to perhaps a dozen rounds total. "Then we improvise." They worked their way down the slope, using the scattered boulders and scrub pine for cover. As they drew closer, Cassandra could make out more details of the camp. Armed guards at regular intervals, a central building that looked like it might house administrative offices, and most telling of all, a railroad survey team working in the valley beyond the camp. "Definitely Wright's operation," Morrison said quietly, "which means everyone down there is either on his payroll or afraid of crossing him." They were still planning their approach when fate took the decision out of their hands. A woman's scream echoed across the valley, followed by rough male laughter and shouted commands in Spanish. Morrison and Cassandra crawled to the edge of a rocky outcrop and looked down into the camp. What they saw made Cassandra's blood run cold. In the center of the compound, a young Apache woman was being dragged from one of the buildings by 2 railroad workers. Her dress was torn, her face bruised, and her struggles only seemed to amuse her captors. A small crowd of men had gathered to watch their faces, showing varying degrees of excitement and indifference. "Consuela!" an older Apache man called out, trying to reach the woman. He was held back by rifle-wielding guards, his own face bearing the marks of recent violence. "Fresh entertainment for the boys?" One of the workers laughed. "Indian women know their place, not like these uppity white ladies we've been hearing about." The casual cruelty of it, the dehumanizing laughter, reminded Cassandra viscerally of the photographs in her saddlebags. This was how it started, with small acts of brutality that escalated into wholesale slaughter. She felt Morrison tense beside her, his hand moving to his rifle. "Jake, no," she whispered urgently. "There are too many of them. It's suicide." "I can't just watch," Morrison replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Those are Running Bear's people down there. The few survivors from Bitter Creek." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Nathaniel hadn't just massacred Apache families, he'd enslaved the survivors, using them as forced labor for his railroad construction. The cruelty was breathtaking in its scope. "If we die here, the evidence dies with us," Cassandra reminded him. "And all those people, the dead ones and the living ones, they'll never see justice." Morrison's finger hovered over his rifle's trigger, every instinct screaming at him to act. But Cassandra was right. A frontal assault would accomplish nothing except adding their bodies to the count of Nathaniel Wright's victims. "There has to be another way," he said through gritted teeth. That was when they heard the hoofbeats approaching from behind Steele's men, finally emerging from the mine and picking up their trail. The fugitives were caught between two forces of enemies with innocent lives hanging in the balance. Morrison made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd learned in 8 years of cavalry service. "We're going down there," he said quietly, "but not to fight, to talk." Cassandra stared at him. "Talk with railroad thugs who are about to assault that woman." "Your husband's men don't know what you look like," Morrison explained, his mind racing through possibilities. "And I'm just another drifter looking for work. If we can get close enough, maybe we can create enough confusion to free those Apache and get the horses we need." It was a desperate plan with about a dozen ways to go wrong, but it was better than waiting for Steele to catch up to them. Together they worked their way down the slope, keeping their weapons hidden but ready. As they approached the camp's perimeter, Morrison called out in a voice pitched to carry, "Hello, the camp. Got a wounded woman here, needs medical attention." The guards turned toward them, rifles raised but not immediately threatening. In the center of the compound, the assault on the Apache woman paused as attention shifted to the newcomers. "Who are you?" demanded the camp foreman, a heavy-set man with the soft look of someone who ordered violence rather than committing it personally. "Name's Morrison," Jake replied, helping Cassandra walk with an exaggerated limp. "Found this lady wandering in the desert half dead from thirst. She's been rambling about Indians and railroad trouble, but I figured someone here might know what to do with her." The foreman's eyes sharpened with interest as he studied Cassandra's face. She kept her expression vacant, playing the role of a traumatized survivor while internally cataloging the positions of guards and weapons. "Bring her to the medical station," the foreman ordered. Then to one of his men, "Send a telegram to the main office. Describe the woman. See if there's any bounty out on her." They were escorted into the camp past the Apache prisoners and toward a small building marked with a red cross. Morrison counted at least 20 armed men plus the civilian workers. Long odds, but he'd faced worse. The camp doctor was a thin, nervous man who clearly preferred treating injuries to inflicting them. He examined Cassandra's ribs with professional competence, while Morrison stood guard, his hand resting casually near his concealed Colt. 3 broken ribs, extensive bruising, the doctor reported to the foreman. She's been through significant trauma, physical and possibly mental. "Can she travel?" The foreman asked. "Not safely. She needs rest and proper care." The foreman nodded thoughtfully. "Put her in the secure quarters. Post a guard. If this is who I think it is, she's worth more than all the silver in these mountains." As they were led away from the medical station, Morrison caught Cassandra's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the building where the Apache prisoners were being held. She understood when the moment came that would be their first priority. The secure quarters turned out to be a small adobe building with barred windows and a single door. A guard took position outside while Morrison and Cassandra were locked inside with a bucket of water and some stale bread. "Well," Cassandra said quietly, testing the strength of the window bars, "this is an improvement over hanging from a cliff." Morrison couldn't help but smile at her dark humor. "You're taking this remarkably well for a woman who was probably attending charity luncheons a week ago." "A week ago, I thought my biggest problem was choosing between the pink dress and the blue one for the governor's reception," Cassandra replied. "Amazing how quickly your priorities change when people start trying to kill you." She moved to the single window and peered out at the camp. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of red and gold. In a few hours, darkness would provide cover for whatever desperate escape plan they could devise. "Jake," she said softly, "what you said about the Apache woman about running bears people. How do you know?" Morrison joined her at the window, his eyes finding the building where the native prisoners were being held. "Consuela is Ayanna's cousin. We met during the peace negotiations before—" He trailed off, old pain flickering across his features. "She was at Bitter Creek. One of the few who survived. I tried to find the survivors after I got out of military prison, but they'd vanished. Now I know where they went." His voice hardened. "Your husband didn't just kill their families, he enslaved the ones who lived." The casual evil of it was almost beyond comprehension. Nathaniel hadn't just committed murder. He'd created an entire system of oppression and exploitation, all hidden behind the respectable facade of railroad development. "When we get out of here," Cassandra said, and Morrison noted that she said, "when, not if, those Apache come with us, all of them. That's going to complicate things considerably." "I don't care. I won't leave them to suffer because it's convenient." Morrison studied her profile in the fading light, noting the determination in the set of her jaw. This wasn't the pampered railroad wife he'd rescued from the canyon anymore. Somewhere in the past day and night, Cassandra Wright had found steel in her spine. "All right," he said quietly. "We save them all, or we don't save anyone." Outside, they could hear the camp settling into its evening routine, guard changes, workers heading to their quarters, the sounds of cooking fires being lit. But underneath the normal activities, there was a tension that suggested unusual events were afoot. "Riders coming in," someone called from the perimeter. "Looks like Captain Steele's group." Cassandra felt her heart sink. Steele had found their trail after all, and now they were trapped with nowhere to run. In a few minutes, the bounty hunters would confirm her identity, and any chance of escape would disappear. But Morrison was smiling grimly, as if the arrival of their pursuers was somehow good news. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking that Captain Marcus Steele is about to get a very unpleasant surprise," Morrison replied, moving away from the window. "And in the confusion that follows, we're going to have our best chance to get out of here." Before Cassandra could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hooves filled the evening air. Through the window, she could see Steele and his men riding into the camp, their faces grim with exhaustion and frustration. The camp foreman hurried out to meet them, clearly excited about his prize catch. "Captain Steele, perfect timing. We've got the right woman in custody, just like the telegrams described." Steele dismounted heavily, his uniform dusty from hours of tracking through difficult terrain. "Where is she?" "Secure building under guard. The man with her claims to be a drifter who found her wandering, but what man?" Steele's voice was sharp with sudden alarm. "Called himself Morrison, said he was looking for—" Steele didn't wait for the foreman to finish. He was already running toward their prison, his hand on his sidearm. But as he reached the building, he skidded to a halt, staring at something that made his face go white. Cassandra followed his gaze and gasped. There, clearly visible in the dust beside their building, someone had scratched a symbol, an eagle with spread wings surrounded by Apache words. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Morrison's smile was predatory. "It means Running Bear knows we're here, and it means Captain Marcus Steele is about to face something he never expected." As if summoned by his words, a haunting cry echoed across the valley, the war call of Apache warriors preparing for battle. It was answered by another cry from the opposite ridge, then another from the hills beyond. Steele spun around his face, a mask of barely controlled panic. "Sound the alarm," he shouted. "Apache war party, all hands to arms." But even as the camp erupted into chaos, Cassandra realized the truth. This wasn't a random Apache raid. This was a rescue mission carefully planned and perfectly timed, and in the confusion that followed, anything might be possible. The Apache war cry split the mountain air like a blade through silk, rising and falling in haunting harmonies that spoke of ancient grievances and blood debts finally coming due. Chief Running Bear's voice carried over the others, a sound Jake Morrison hadn't heard in 3 years, but would recognize until his dying day, the battle song of his blood brother, calling for vengeance against those who had murdered their children. "Jesus Christ!" Captain Steele breathed, his face going ashen, as more war cries answered from the surrounding ridges. "How many of them are there?" The camp foreman was already shouting orders, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Every man to arms, form defensive positions. Someone get a message to the territorial garrison." But Morrison knew it was too late for that. The Apache had chosen their moment perfectly, sunset, when the long shadows would hide their movements and the guards would be changing shifts. The war party had probably been watching the camp for hours, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. From their makeshift prison, Cassandra watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of terror and fascination. "How many warriors?" she asked Morrison, who was studying the ridgelines with professional interest. "Hard to say from here," he replied, noting the strategic positioning of the war cries. "But Running Bear's no fool. He wouldn't attack a fortified position without overwhelming force or significant advantage." A rifle shot cracked from the camp's perimeter, followed immediately by return fire from the hills. The battle had begun. "What do we do?" Cassandra asked, pressing herself against the wall as bullets began whistling overhead. Morrison was already working at the window bars with his knife, testing their anchoring points in the adobe. "We get ready to run like hell," he said grimly. because in about 5 minutes this place is going to be a battlefield. The first Apache warriors appeared like ghosts materializing from the evening shadows, painted figures moving with deadly silence through the camp's outer defenses. They struck the guards with knives and tomahawks before the white men even knew they were under attack. Steele rallied his men near the central building, forming a defensive square with practiced efficiency. "Hold your fire until you have clear targets," he commanded. "Make every shot count." But the Apache weren't attacking in a straight line. They came from multiple directions at once, using the buildings and equipment for cover striking and fading like smoke. Morrison recognized the tactics Running Bear had learned much from his battles with the cavalry, adapting traditional Apache warfare to defeat conventional military strategies. There, Cassandra pointed through the window, the Apache prisoners. Across the compound, Consuela and the other native captives were being herded at gunpoint toward the central building. The camp foreman clearly intended to use them as human shields, a tactic that would complicate any rescue attempt. Morrison's jaw tightened as he saw his people, Ayana's people, being brutalized yet again. The knife blade slipped in his grip, drawing blood from his palm, but he barely noticed. "We have to help them," Cassandra said urgently. "Working on it," Morrison replied, putting his full weight behind the knife as he worked to loosen the window bars. The old adobe cracked and shifted but held. A new sound cut through the battle noise, the thundering of hooves approaching from the east. Morrison's blood turned to ice as he recognized the distinctive rhythm of cavalry horses moving at full gallop. "Federal troops," he said grimly. "Company strength, maybe more." Cassandra felt her heart sink. "My husband's reinforcements." "Has to be, which means we're about to be caught in the middle of a three-way fight: Apache warriors, railroad thugs, and federal cavalry." Morrison redoubled his efforts on the window bars. "And none of them are particularly fond of us." The first cavalry troops crested the ridge, just as the Apache attack reached its crescendo. Blue-uniformed soldiers poured down the slope with sabers, drawn, their battle cry adding to the chaos. But instead of joining forces with the railroad men, they opened fire on everyone in sight. "What the hell?" Steele shouted, diving for cover as cavalry bullets whined past his position. "We're on the same side, you idiots!" But Morrison was beginning to understand what was happening. "They're not here to rescue the camp," he told Cassandra. "They're here to eliminate witnesses, everyone who knows about Wright's Operation Apache railroad workers, even us." It was a masterstroke of ruthless calculation. By staging a three-way battle and killing everyone present, Nathaniel Wright could eliminate the evidence of his crimes while blaming the whole thing on an Apache uprising. The surviving Apache would be hunted down and exterminated, the railroad workers would be dismissed as casualties of war, and the truth would die with them. "That bastard," Cassandra breathed, understanding the full scope of her husband's betrayal. "He's going to murder his own men to cover his tracks." "Your husband didn't get where he is by being sentimental," Morrison replied, finally working one of the window bars loose. "Give me a hand with this." Together they managed to bend the iron bar enough to create an opening wide enough to squeeze through. Morrison went first, dropping to the ground and checking for immediate threats before helping Cassandra through the window. The camp was complete chaos now. Apache warriors, railroad workers, and cavalry troopers were fighting in a confused melee that made it almost impossible to tell friend from foe. Muzzle flashes lit the gathering darkness like deadly fireworks, and the air was thick with gunsmoke and dust. "This way," Morrison said, drawing his Colt and leading Cassandra toward the building where the Apache prisoners were being held. They moved carefully, using the confusion to mask their approach. They had almost reached their destination when a figure stepped out of the shadows directly in front of them. Captain Marcus Steele, his uniform torn and bloody, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Well, well," Steele said, his revolver trained on Morrison's chest. "Jake Morrison and the elusive Mrs. Wright. Fancy meeting you here." "Marcus," Morrison replied calmly, his own weapon steady in his grip. "You're looking a little worse for wear." "Your Apache friends are putting up quite a fight," Steele admitted. "But then you always did have a talent for stirring up trouble with the savages." "These savages are fighting for their lives," Morrison shot back. "Something you might want to consider given that your federal friends are shooting at you too." Steele's eyes flickered toward where cavalry troopers were indeed firing at the railroad workers. "Temporary confusion. Once we sort out the Apache problem, everything will return to normal." "Normal?" Cassandra stepped forward, her voice cutting through the battle noise. "You call murdering families normal. You call enslaving survivors normal. I call it progress, Mrs. Wright, Steele replied with a cold smile. Civilization advancing over barbarism. Your husband understands that sometimes unpleasant necessities must be. His words were cut off by a war cry that seemed to come from directly above them. All three looked up to see an Apache warrior dropping from the roof of the building, tomahawk raised for a killing blow. Steele tried to swing his gun around, but he was too slow. The warrior's tomahawk caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his revolver flying into the darkness. Morrison recognized the warrior immediately, Nalnish, one of Running Bear's most trusted fighters, and Ayana's younger brother. The Apache's face was painted for war, but his eyes burned with personal hatred as he faced the cavalry captain who had helped murder his sister. "You," Nalnish said in heavily accented English, his tomahawk dripping with Steele's blood. "You killed Ayana. You killed the children." Steele scrambled backwards, clutching his wounded shoulder. "It was war. We had orders. I was just following orders." Nalnish spat. "White man's word for murder." He raised his tomahawk for the killing blow, but Morrison stepped between them. "Wait," Morrison said in Apache, his words careful and respectful. "This one's death belongs to the courts, not the battlefield." Nalnish's eyes flicked to Morrison, taking in his pale skin and cavalry hat. For a moment, tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Then the Apache warrior's expression changed as recognition dawned. "Ghost who rides with thunder," Nalnish said, using Morrison's Apache name. "My brother-in-law, you live." "I live," Morrison confirmed, "and I mourn our family every day." The emotional reunion was interrupted by a new volley of gunfire from the central building. Cassandra pointed urgently toward the source. "The prisoners, they're trying to move them." Indeed, the camp foreman and several guards were attempting to relocate the Apache captives, using them as human shields as they fought their way toward the corral. If they reached the horses, they could escape with their valuable prisoners and valuable evidence. "Go," Nalnish said, pushing Steele roughly toward Morrison. "Save our people. I will deal with this one." But before Morrison could respond, the situation took another deadly turn. A new group of riders thundered into the camp from the south, more railroad enforcers heavily armed and riding hard. At their head rode a figure that made Cassandra's blood turn to ice. Elena Santos, the woman who had introduced herself as Nathaniel's sister, but whom Cassandra now suspected of being something far more dangerous. Elena sat her horse like a Comanche raider, a rifle in her hands and murder in her dark eyes. "Secure the right woman," Elena shouted to her men. "Kill everyone else." The newcomers opened fire immediately, their shots carefully aimed at both the Apache warriors and the federal cavalry. This wasn't random violence, it was systematic elimination. "Who is that?" Morrison demanded, pulling Cassandra behind the cover of a water trough. "Elena Santos," Cassandra replied, watching as the mysterious woman directed her forces with military precision. "She claims to be Nathaniel's sister, but I never believed it. There's something about her." Morrison studied Elena's movements, noting the professional way she coordinated her men's attack. "She moves like a soldier, or a mercenary." A bullet spanged off the water trough inches from Cassandra's head, spraying them both with splinters. Morrison returned fire, but Elena's men had already taken cover behind the camp buildings. "We need to reach those prisoners," Morrison said urgently, "before Elena's people can secure them." "What about Steele?" Cassandra asked, looking back toward where Nalnish was still holding the wounded captain at tomahawk point. "Nalnish can handle himself," Morrison replied. "Right now, saving those Apache is more important than settling old scores." They began working their way toward the central building, moving from cover to cover as the three-way battle raged around them. The confusion was almost overwhelming. Apache warriors firing from the rooftops, cavalry troopers charging with sabers drawn, railroad workers barricaded behind overturned wagons, and Elena's mercenaries advancing with methodical precision. Halfway to their destination, they encountered another familiar face, the camp doctor who had examined Cassandra earlier. The man was crouched behind a pile of supply crates, clearly terrified and trying to avoid the flying bullets. "Doctor," Cassandra called out, "are there medical supplies nearby?" The man looked up, his face pale with fear. "Medical tent. Behind the main building, but it's not safe." His words were cut off as one of Elena's mercenaries spotted them. The man raised his rifle, but Morrison was faster. His colt barked once, and the mercenary spun away with a cry of pain. Thanks for the information, Doc, Morrison said grimly. Now, find somewhere safer to hide. They continued toward the central building, but their path was blocked by a running firefight between Apache warriors and federal cavalry. Morrison recognized the tactical situation immediately. The cavalry had superior firepower, but the Apache had superior positioning and knowledge of the terrain. "This way," he said, leading Cassandra around the edge of the battle. "We'll circle behind. Jake, look out." Cassandra's warning came just in time. Morrison threw himself sideways as a cavalry saber whistled through the air where his head had been. The trooper who'd attacked him was young, perhaps 19, his face bright with battle fever. Morrison rolled to his feet and drew his knife, unwilling to waste ammunition on a single opponent. The young soldier came at him again, his saber cutting deadly arcs through the air. "Federal troops!" the trooper shouted as he attacked. "You're under arrest for—" Morrison's knife found its mark between the young man's ribs, and he crumpled without finishing his sentence. Morrison caught him as he fell, easing him to the ground with surprising gentleness. "Just following orders," Morrison said quietly, echoing Steele's earlier words. "Poor bastard." Cassandra watched him close the dead trooper's eyes with careful reverence. Even in the midst of a deadly battle, Jake Morrison retained his humanity, a quality that seemed increasingly rare in this world of violence and betrayal. They finally reached the central building where the situation had deteriorated even further. The Apache prisoners were now caught in crossfire between Elena's mercenaries and the federal cavalry, with the camp foreman using them as human shields. "We need a distraction," Morrison said, studying the tactical situation. "Something to draw attention away from the prisoners long enough for us to—" His words were interrupted by an explosion that shook the entire camp. One of the storage buildings had caught fire, and the flames had reached a cache of blasting powder left over from the mining operations. In the chaos that followed the explosion, Morrison saw his chance. "Now!" he shouted, charging toward the group of guards holding the Apache prisoners. Cassandra followed close behind, her own weapon drawn despite her broken ribs. She might not be a trained fighter, but she'd learned enough in the past 2 days to know which end of a gun to point at the enemy. Morrison's first shot dropped one guard before the man even knew he was under attack. His second wounded another, sending the man diving for cover. But there were still 4 guards between them and the prisoners, and more mercenaries converging on their position. The camp foreman saw them coming and pressed his revolver against Consuela's temple. "Stop right there," he shouted. "One more step and the squaw dies." Morrison froze his weapon, trained on the foreman, but unable to take the shot without risking Consuela's life. For a moment, the standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Consuela proved that Apache women were far from helpless victims. With a move so quick it was almost invisible, she grabbed the foreman's gun hand and twisted sharply. The revolver discharged into the air as the man screamed in pain from his broken wrist. Consuela followed up with an elbow to his solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping for breath. The other prisoners took their cue from her example. Despite being bound and weakened by captivity, they fought back with desperate courage, kicking, biting, headbutting their captors with whatever strength they had left. Morrison took advantage of the confusion to close the distance, his knife finding its mark in the nearest guard's chest. Cassandra, meanwhile, had somehow gotten hold of a fallen rifle and was providing covering fire with surprising accuracy. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Morrison called out as he cut the ropes binding the Apache prisoners. "Nathaniel insisted I learn," Cassandra replied, working the rifle's bolt with practiced ease. "Said a railroad wife needed to be able to defend herself on the frontier. Ironic, considering I'm now using those skills against his own men." The freed Apache prisoners quickly armed themselves with weapons taken from their fallen guards. Despite their ordeal, they moved with the deadly efficiency of born warriors, immediately taking defensive positions around the building. Consuela approached Morrison, her dark eyes bright with recognition and gratitude. In rapid Apache, she said, "Ghost who rides with thunder. Ayanna spoke of you in her dreams before the soldiers came. She said you would return to help us." Morrison felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I should have come sooner," he replied in the same language. "You came when the spirits called you," Consuela said simply. "That is enough." Their reunion was interrupted by a new sound, the thundering approach of more horses from the east. Morrison climbed onto a wooden crate to get a better view over the camp, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A full cavalry company was approaching at gallop pace, their guidons snapping in the evening wind. At their head rode a figure in a general's uniform, his face hidden beneath the brim of his campaign hat. Federal reinforcements, Morrison called down to the others. At least 60 men, maybe more. But as the cavalry company drew closer, something about their formation struck Morrison as odd. They were riding too fast for a relief column, and their weapons were already drawn for immediate action. "Something's wrong," he said, watching as the approaching troops deployed into battle formation. "Those aren't reinforcements, they're here to finish the job." Elena Santos had apparently reached the same conclusion. From her position near the camp's main gate, she began shouting orders to her mercenaries. "Fall back to the secondary positions, prepare for cavalry charge." The Apache warriors, meanwhile, had melted into the shadows with typical efficiency. They would strike from ambush when the moment was right, using their knowledge of the terrain to offset the cavalry's numerical advantage. As the federal troops reached the camp's perimeter, their commander finally became visible in the flickering light of the burning buildings. Morrison's jaw dropped as he recognized the face beneath the campaign hat. "General Harrison Blackwood," he breathed. "Son of a bitch." "You know him?" Cassandra asked, noting the hatred in Morrison's voice. "Blackwood was Steele's superior during the Apache campaigns," Morrison explained grimly. "The one who gave the orders for Bitter Creek. I thought he'd been transferred back east after the scandal." "What scandal?" "The one your husband bought and buried," Morrison replied. Blackwood was supposed to face a military tribunal for authorizing the massacre. Instead, he disappeared into some cushy Washington posting. Looks like Wright called in a favor. General Blackwood's voice carried across the camp as he addressed his troops. "Gentlemen, we are here to suppress an Apache uprising and restore order to this territory. You will show no mercy to the hostiles, and you will take no prisoners." It was a death sentence for everyone in the camp. Apache railroad workers and fugitives alike. Blackwood intended to kill them all and blame it on Indian raiders. "We need to get out of here," Morrison said urgently, "before they surround the entire camp." "What about the other prisoners?" Cassandra asked, looking toward the other buildings where more Apache captives might be held. Consuela overheard and quickly spoke with the other freed prisoners. "She says there are maybe 20 more in the mining building," Morrison translated. "Mostly women and children." Cassandra made a decision that surprised even herself. "Then we get them all out. I won't leave anyone behind to be slaughtered by that madman." Morrison studied her face in the firelight, seeing the steel determination that had carried her through the past 2 days of hell. This woman had come a long way from the pampered railroad wife who'd fled her husband's mansion. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this fast and we do it smart. The Apache can handle themselves in a fight, but we need to get the non-combatants clear before Blackwood's cavalry gets organized." He turned to Consuela and quickly outlined a plan in Apache. She nodded and began relaying instructions to the other warriors. Within moments, they had spread out to secure the route to the mining building. Morrison and Cassandra began working their way across the camp, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Behind them, General Blackwood was deploying his troops with the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades suppressing native uprisings. "First platoon secure the eastern perimeter," he commanded. "Second platoon advance on the central buildings. Third platoon maintain reserve and watch for breakout attempts." The net was closing rapidly, but Morrison had one advantage that Blackwood didn't expect. He knew this terrain intimately from his years as a cavalry scout. There were ways out of the camp that wouldn't show up on any military map. They reached the mining building without incident, finding it guarded by only 2 mercenaries who were more concerned with the approaching cavalry than with watching their rear. Morrison and Cassandra eliminated them quietly using knife and pistol butt rather than gunfire that might alert other enemies. Inside the building, they found a sight that made Cassandra's heart break. Nearly 30 Apache prisoners, mostly women, children, and elderly men, were chained to the walls like animals. Their condition spoke of weeks or months of systematic abuse and neglect. "My God," Cassandra whispered, seeing children who couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years old bearing the marks of beatings. "How could anyone do this?" "Same way your husband ordered the massacre of entire villages," Morrison replied grimly, working to free the prisoners with tools taken from the guards, by convincing themselves that Apache aren't really human. The liberation of the prisoners went quickly, but several were too weak to travel. Morrison made another hard decision. They would have to be carried, even though it would slow their escape considerably. As they prepared to leave the building, the sound of approaching gunfire grew steadily louder. Blackwood's cavalry was systematically working their way through the camp, killing anyone they found. "This way," Morrison said. leading the group toward a section of the camp's perimeter that backed up against a steep hillside. "There's an old mine entrance about 50 yards up that slope. If we can reach it—" His words were cut off by a shout from behind them. One of Elena's mercenaries had spotted the escaping prisoners and was raising the alarm. "Run!" Morrison commanded, shoving Cassandra toward the hillside. "Don't look back!" The next few minutes were a nightmare of stumbling flight through darkness and gunfire. The Apache prisoners, despite their weakened condition, showed remarkable endurance as they climbed the treacherous slope. Morrison and Cassandra brought up the rear, providing covering fire for the more vulnerable members of the group. They were almost to the mine entrance when disaster struck. A cavalry patrol moving faster than expected appeared on the slope above them. The soldiers had clearly been placed there to cut off exactly this kind of escape attempt. "Federal troops, Apache," the patrol leader shouted. "Surrender immediately or be fired upon." Morrison knew there was no point in surrendering. Blackwood's orders had been clear. Anyone found in the camp was to be eliminated as a hostile insurgent. "Keep moving," he called to the Apache prisoners. "Whatever happens, don't stop." He turned to make his stand against the cavalry patrol, but found Cassandra beside him, her rifle ready despite her injuries. "I told you," she said firmly. "We do this together." Morrison wanted to argue, wanted to send her ahead with the prisoners, but there was no time for debate. The cavalry patrol was already opening fire, their bullets whining off the rocks around the escaping group. Morrison and Cassandra returned fire from whatever cover they could find, scattered boulders, scrub pine, the occasional mining timber. They were outnumbered 5-1, but they had the advantage of fighting for something more important than orders or politics. The firefight might have gone badly for them if not for an unexpected intervention. Apache war cries echoed from the ridges above, and suddenly the cavalry patrol found itself under attack from multiple directions. Running Bear himself appeared like an avenging spirit, his rifle speaking death to the soldiers who had come to complete the work begun at Bitter Creek. Behind him came a dozen of his finest warriors, their painted faces terrible in the muzzle flashes. The cavalry patrol caught between two forces and, fighting uphill in darkness, broke and ran. Several soldiers fell to Apache bullets or arrows, while the survivors fled back toward the main camp. Running Bear approached Morrison with the stately dignity of a man who had seen too much death, but had never stopped fighting for his people's survival. Despite the war paint and the weapons, his eyes held a warmth that spoke of old friendship. "Ghost who rides with thunder," he said in English, grasping Morrison's hand in both of his. "You have returned to us in our hour of need." "I came as soon as I could," Morrison replied, "but I should have—" "The past is gone like smoke on the wind," Running Bear interrupted. "What matters is now, and the lives we can still save." He turned to study Cassandra with curious eyes, taking in her obvious exhaustion and injuries, but also noting the rifle in her hands and the determination in her stance. "This is the woman who carries proof of the railroad man's crimes?" he asked. "Cassandra Wright," Morrison confirmed. "She risked everything to bring evidence of what her husband has done." Running Bear nodded slowly. "A woman of courage. Ayanna would have liked her." The simple words carried more weight than any formal introduction. In Apache culture, to be compared favorably to a beloved daughter was the highest honor that could be bestowed. "Thank you," Cassandra said quietly, understanding the significance of the compliment. "We must go," Running Bear said, turning back to Morrison. "Blackwood brings many soldiers, and more are coming from the territorial garrison. Soon this place will be too dangerous even for the Apache." "Where can we take the prisoners?" Morrison asked. "They're in no condition for a long journey." Running Bear smiled grimly. "There is a place. Sacred caves where our people have sheltered for many generations. Hidden trails that no white man knows. We can rest there, tend the wounded, and plan what comes next." As they began organizing the evacuation, Elena Santos's voice cut through the battle noise from somewhere below. "Find them!" she was shouting to her remaining mercenaries. "The woman has evidence that could destroy everything. Bring me her head, and Wright will make us all rich." Morrison and Cassandra exchanged a meaningful glance. Elena's words confirmed what they had both suspected. She wasn't just Nathaniel's sister or business partner. She was the enforcer who handled the dirty work that even a corrupt railroad baron couldn't be directly connected to. "Who is she really?" Morrison asked as they helped the Apache prisoners toward Running Bear's hidden trail. Cassandra thought back to her interactions with Elena, remembering details that had seemed insignificant at the time. "She has a Mexican accent, but it's not consistent. Sometimes it disappears entirely when she's angry, and her hands—" She paused, trying to articulate what had bothered her. "Her hands are scarred," she continued. "Old knife scars, the kind you get from fighting with blades, and she moves like someone who's been in combat." Morrison nodded grimly. "Professional killer. Probably been working for your husband for years, handling the problems that can't be solved with bribes or legal maneuvering." They reached the hidden trail just as a massive explosion shook the valley below. Looking back, they could see that the camp's ammunition storage had caught fire, sending a pillar of flame and smoke high into the night sky. In the hellish light of the explosion, the scope of the battle became clear. General Blackwood's cavalry was fighting a running battle with Apache warriors throughout the camp, while Elena's mercenaries tried to escape with whatever loot they could carry. Bodies littered the ground, and the air was thick with smoke and the screams of wounded men. "Nathaniel will blame all of this on an Apache uprising," Cassandra said, watching the destruction with a mixture of horror and fascination. "He'll use it to justify even more aggressive action against the tribes." "Not if we can reach Santa Fe with that evidence," Morrison replied. "Colonel Harper has the authority to investigate federal crimes. If we can get the documents to him, if we can stay alive long enough." Running Bear interrupted pragmatically. "Come, the hidden trail awaits, but we must move quickly before the fire spreads to the forest." They began the long climb into the sacred mountains, leaving behind the burning camp and its cargo of death. Behind them, the battle continued to rage as three separate forces fought for control of the ruins. But ahead lay the possibility of safety, of rest, and of justice for the murdered Apache families whose deaths had started this entire bloody chain of events. As they climbed, Cassandra found herself walking beside Consuela, who, despite her ordeal, maintained the dignified bearing of Apache nobility. The two women couldn't communicate directly, but they shared the bond of survivors, women who had endured brutality, but had never surrendered their essential humanity. Near the top of the ridge, Morrison called a brief halt to tend to the wounded and reorganize their group. As he worked to bind an injured child's leg, Cassandra approached him with a question that had been growing in her mind. "Jake," she said quietly, "what happens when we reach the sacred caves? We can't hide there forever, and my husband's reach extends throughout the territory." Morrison finished his bandaging before looking up at her. In the moonlight, his weathered features looked older, marked by the night's violence and the weight of old sorrows. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but we'll figure it out, together." The word "together" carried a weight that went beyond their immediate circumstances. Somewhere in the past 3 days, they had become more than allies of convenience. They had become partners in a fight that neither could win alone. As they resumed their climb toward the sacred caves, the sound of gunfire gradually faded behind them. But all three of them, Morrison, Cassandra, and Running Bear, knew that this was only the beginning. Elena Santos was still alive, still hunting them with professional determination. General Blackwood would soon report the Apache uprising to his superiors, triggering a massive military response. And Nathaniel Wright would stop at nothing to silence the woman who could destroy his empire. The real war was just beginning. The sacred caves of the Anasazi stretched deep into the heart of the mountain, their ancient walls bearing pictographs that told stories older than memory. In the flickering light of carefully tended fires, Apache elders tended to the wounded, while children who had seen too much violence finally slept in safety. But Jake Morrison couldn't rest. He stood at the cave mouth, watching the distant glow of fires in the valley below, knowing that their enemies were regrouping for another assault. "You cannot watch the whole world, ghost who rides with thunder," Running Bear said quietly, approaching with 2 cups of bitter coffee. "Sometimes a warrior must trust others to share the burden." Morrison accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands wrapped around the warm tin cup. "General Blackwood has probably called for reinforcements from Fort Union by now. That's 2 companies of cavalry plus artillery. Even these mountains won't protect us from that kind of force." "The spirits have protected these caves for 1,000 years, Running Bear replied with calm certainty. "They will not abandon us now when our need is greatest." From deeper in the cave system came the sound of voices, Cassandra Wright speaking in halting Apache, with Consuela trying to learn the words for healing herbs. Despite her broken ribs and exhaustion, she had insisted on helping tend to the rescued prisoners, working alongside the Apache women with a determination that had earned their respect. She is strong, your woman, Running Bear observed, following Morrison's gaze. She's not my woman, Morrison said automatically, then paused. I mean, we're not. It's complicated. Running Bear's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Ayana once told me that the spirits sometimes bring two broken people together so they can heal each other's wounds. Perhaps this is such a time. Before Morrison could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the valley below. Both men tensed, but these were different hoofbeats, a single rider approaching carefully rather than aggressively. One of ours, Running Bear said after listening for a moment. Nyalnish returning from his scouting mission. Indeed, the young Apache warrior appeared at the cave mouth minutes later, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgent news. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his report. Morrison's face darkened as he translated for his own understanding. He says there's a train coming from the east, special engine with armored cars heavily guarded. Elena Santos is aboard along with more mercenaries and, he paused, his expression growing even more troubled, and Nathaniel Wright himself. The news hit like a physical blow. If Cassandra's husband was coming personally, it meant he considered the situation dire enough to risk his own safety. More importantly, it meant he had given up any pretense of maintaining his respectable facade. How far out? Morrison asked. Half a day. Nalnish replied in English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. But the train, it does not come to the mining camp. It stops at the railroad depot in Silver Creek. Morrison's blood ran cold. Silver Creek was a small settlement 20 miles north of their current position, close enough for Wright's forces to use as a staging area, but far enough away to maintain the fiction that this was a routine business trip rather than a military operation. There's more, Nalnish continued. Many soldiers from Fort Union are already moving towards Silver Creek. I counted at least 3 companies, maybe more. And they bring big guns, howitzers. Morrison closed his eyes, calculating distances and troop movements. Wright wasn't just bringing overwhelming force. He was bringing enough firepower to reduce the entire mountain to rubble if necessary. We need to warn the others, Morrison said, turning toward the cave interior. But Running Bear caught his arm. Wait, the Apache chief said quietly. There is something else you must know. While Naalnish was watching the soldiers, he saw something that changes everything. The young warrior nodded grimly and pulled a folded paper from inside his shirt. I took this from dead soldier at the mining camp, orders signed by the territorial governor himself. Morrison unfolded the paper and read it by firelight, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Running Bear with something approaching despair. What does it say? Cassandra asked, appearing at his shoulder. She'd been listening to the conversation, and though she couldn't understand Apache, she could read the tension in the men's faces. It's a federal arrest warrant, Morrison said heavily, issued for one Cassandra Wright wanted for treason, espionage, and inciting Indian uprisings. The bounty is $10,000 dead or alive. Cassandra felt the blood drain from her face. Treason, but that's a capital offense. Your husband has been busy, Morrison continued grimly. According to these orders, you're accused of selling military secrets to hostile Apache forces, providing them with weapons and ammunition, and conspiring to overthrow the territorial government. That's insane, Cassandra breathed. No one would believe such accusations. They don't have to believe them, Morrison replied. They just have to follow orders. Wright has turned you from a victim into a traitor in the eyes of the law. Every federal marshal, every territorial ranger, every local sheriff will now consider you an enemy of the United States. The full scope of Nathaniel's trap was becoming clear. By framing Cassandra as a traitor who had allied with hostile Indians, he could justify using massive military force to hunt her down. When she was finally killed, resisting arrest, any evidence she carried would be dismissed as enemy propaganda. But Colonel Harper, Cassandra said desperately, you said he was investigating railroad corruption. Surely he would. Colonel Harper was found dead in his hotel room in Santa Fe 3 days ago, Nalnish said quietly. Apparent heart attack, very sad. His investigation papers, they mysteriously disappeared. The last hope for official justice had been eliminated with characteristic efficiency. Wright's reach extended even to federal investigators who might have posed a threat to his operations. Morrison crumpled the arrest warrant in his fist, his face a mask of controlled fury. Son of a bitch has thought of everything. We can't go to the authorities because they'll arrest Cassandra on sight. We can't hide in these mountains indefinitely because he's bringing enough firepower to blast us out. And we can't run because half the territory is looking for us. Then, what do we do? Cassandra asked, though she could see the answer forming in Morrison's pale blue eyes. We stop running, he said quietly. We take the fight to him. Running Bear nodded approvingly. Now you speak like a warrior instead of a hunted animal. What do you propose? Morrison moved to a flat section of cave wall where someone had scratched a rough map of the surrounding territory. He studied it for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities and calculating risks. Wright's bringing evidence of his crimes with him, Morrison said, finally. Financial records correspondence with corrupt officials, maybe even photographs from other massacre sites. He can't risk leaving that kind of material unguarded while he's away from his headquarters. You want to attack his train? Cassandra asked, her voice a mixture of admiration and terror. I want to rob his train, Morrison corrected. Take his evidence and add it to yours. With that much documentation, we could take our case directly to Washington to people even Wright can't buy or intimidate. The armored cars, Running Bear observed pragmatically. They will not be easy to breach. No, Morrison agreed. But I know someone who might be able to help with that problem. He turned to Nalnish. In your scouting, did you see any sign of the Mendoza gang? The young Apache's eyes lit up with understanding. The Mexican bandits see. They have camped maybe 10 miles south near the old Spanish mission. Why do you ask? Because Carlos Mendoza owes me a favor, Morrison replied grimly. And he's the best demolitions man this side of the Rio Grande. Over the next hour, Morrison outlined his plan to the assembled Apache warriors and the few other fighters among the rescued prisoners. It was audacious to the point of madness, a coordinated attack on an armored train carrying some of the most dangerous men in the territory, but it was also their only chance to turn the tables on Wright before his superior forces could crush them. The train will be most vulnerable at Devil's Bend, Morrison explained, pointing to a section of track that curved around a steep hillside. The locomotives have to slow down there because of the grade, and there's only one way in or out. If we can stop the train at that point and breach the armored cars quickly enough. We could be in and out before reinforcements arrive, Cassandra finished. She'd been studying the map with the same intensity as the warriors, her mind grasping the tactical implications, despite her lack of military training. It's still extremely dangerous, Morrison warned. Morrison, Wright's guards will be well armed and professional. Even with Mendoza's explosives, we'll be outnumbered 3-1. Then we need an advantage they won't expect, Running Bear said thoughtfully. Something that will divide their attention and create confusion. Consuela, who had been listening quietly to the discussion, spoke up for the first time. In rapid Apache, she outlined an idea that made several of the warriors nod with approval. She suggests a diversion, Morrison translated. A false attack on Wright's forces at Silver Creek, timed to draw away some of his guards just before the train reaches Devil's Bend. Can we spare the men for 2 operations? Cassandra asked. Running Bear smiled grimly. We will not be alone. Word of the mining camp massacre has spread to other Apache bands. They are angry and they are coming to help us fight. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching riders echoed from outside the cave. But these were different from the previous arrivals, more numerous, and moving with the confident discipline of an organized war party. Nyalnish quickly went to investigate, returning with news that made everyone in the cave sit up straighter. Mescalero Apache from the southern mountains, he reported. 50 warriors led by War Chief Ironhawk. They say they have come to repay old debts. The arrival of Apache reinforcements changed the tactical equation dramatically. With nearly 100 warriors at their disposal, Morrison could now contemplate operations that would have been impossible with their original small band. But as the newcomers were welcomed into the cave, Morrison noticed something that made him uneasy. Not all of the Mescalero warriors looked pleased to see him. Some shot hostile glances in his direction, their hands resting on their weapons. War Chief Ironhawk was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles. When he approached Morrison, his expression was neutral, but his eyes were cold. You are the white man they call Ghost Who Rides with Thunder, Ironhawk said in careful English, the one who married into the Chiricahua people. I am, Morrison replied cautiously, sensing undercurrents in the conversation that he didn't fully understand. My nephew died at Bitter Creek, Ironhawk continued, killed by soldiers under Captain Steele's command. Some of my warriors believe you could have done more to prevent the massacre. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Morrison felt the weight of eyes upon him, Apache warriors measuring his response, Cassandra watching with concern. Running Bear, maintaining carefully neutral expression. Your nephew was a brave warrior, Morrison said finally. And you're right, I could have done more. I could have shot Steele before he gave the order to fire. I could have turned my weapon on my own men to force them to stop. Instead, I tried to work within military discipline, and good people died because of my hesitation. Ironhawk studied him for a long moment, searching for deception or excuse. Finding neither, he nodded slowly. A man who admits his failures has taken the first step toward wisdom, the war chief said. My warriors and I will fight beside you, ghost who rides with thunder. But know this, if you fail our people again, I will kill you myself. Fair enough, Morrison replied, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Ironhawk grasped it in the traditional warrior's grip. With the political tensions resolved for the moment, Morrison returned to planning the dual operations against Wright's forces. The arrival of the Mescalero warriors had given them the numbers they needed, but it had also complicated the command structure. Ironhawk will lead the diversion attack on Silver Creek, Running Bear decided after consulting with the other chiefs. He knows the terrain there, and his warriors are fresh for battle. I will take the Chiricahua fighters and join the train robbery at Devil's Bend. What about me? Cassandra asked. I'm not sitting in these caves while everyone else risks their lives. Morrison started to object, but the look in her eyes stopped him. This was the woman who had faced down bounty hunters, escaped from an underground mine, and fought her way through a three-way battle. She had earned the right to see this through to the end. You'll need to identify Wright's private documents, Morrison admitted reluctantly. You know his handwriting, his personal seals. Without that knowledge, we might steal the wrong materials. Then it's settled, Cassandra said with finality. I'm going on the train robbery. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of preparation and movement. Morrison rode south to make contact with Carlos Mendoza, finding the Mexican bandit leader camped in the ruins of an old Spanish mission. Mendoza was a compact, dark-haired man with intelligent eyes and hands that could build a bomb out of mining supplies and prayer. Jake Morrison, Mendoza said with a grin, embracing his old friend, I heard you were dead killed by angry husbands or jealous senoritas. Not yet, Carlos, Morrison replied, but I need your help with something that might change that. When Morrison outlined his plan to rob Wright's armored train, Mendoza's grin grew even wider. Dios mío, my friend, you always did think big, but an armored train that will require something special. From his supplies, Mendoza produced several sticks of dynamite and a collection of metal cylinders that looked like oversized rifle cartridges. Shaped charges, he explained. I learned to make them from a German engineer who worked for Maximilian. They will cut through armor plate like a knife through butter. What's the catch? Morrison asked, knowing his friend well enough to recognize that something was bothering him. Mendoza's expression grew serious. The catch, amigo, is that I have been watching Wright's operations for months. He is not just another corrupt businessman. The man has connections that reach all the way to Mexico City, maybe even to Europe. Cross him, and you make enemies of people you have never heard of. Already crossed him, Morrison replied grimly. Question is, are you with me or not? Mendoza considered for a long moment, weighing friendship against prudence. Finally, he shrugged in the fatalistic manner of men who had lived too long by violence. What the hell? He said. Life is boring without a little danger, but I want half of whatever gold you find on that train. Deal, Morrison agreed, though he privately doubted there would be any gold to split. This wasn't about robbery, it was about justice. While Morrison was recruiting Mendoza, Cassandra spent her time in the sacred caves learning what she could about Apache warfare from the women warriors. Despite their traditional roles as mothers and keepers of culture, Apache women were fully capable fighters when circumstances demanded it. The key is to think like water, Consuela explained through a mixture of broken English and hand gestures. Flow around obstacles, find the weak spots, strike and withdraw before the enemy can respond. Cassandra practiced with a captured rifle under the watchful eyes of several Apache women, her accuracy improving with each shot. Her broken ribs still pained her, but she had learned to work around the injury, adapting her stance and breathing to compensate. "You shoot like a hunter, not a warrior," observed an elderly Apache woman named Maria Elena. "You aim for the center of the target, try to kill cleanly. But in battle, sometimes it is better to wound many enemies than to kill a few." Wounded men cry out, distract their comrades, consume medical resources. It was a brutal calculation, but Cassandra was beginning to understand that survival in this harsh land required a different kind of thinking than she'd learned in drawing rooms and finishing schools. As the time for the operation approached, Morrison returned with Mendoza and his explosives. The Mexican bandits studied the assembled Apache warriors with professional interest, noting their weapons and organization. "These are serious fighters," he told Morrison quietly. "They remind me of Juarez's guerrillas during the French occupation. Very dangerous, very determined." "They've got good reason to be," Morrison replied. "Wright's people have been systematically murdering their families for 2 years. The final planning session took place in the largest of the cave chambers, with Apache chiefs, Mexican bandits, and 2 fugitive Americans huddled around a fire that painted dancing shadows on ancient walls. It was an unlikely alliance, but it was united by a common desire to see justice done. The train reaches Devil's Bend at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Morrison said, consulting a railroad timetable that Nalnish had obtained from a sympathetic station agent. "Iron Hawk's diversion attack on Silver Creek begins 30 minutes earlier, drawing away Wright's mobile reserves. My charges will be in position on the tracks," Mendoza added. "Not enough to derail the train completely, but sufficient to stop it and disable the locomotive." "Once the train is stopped, we move fast," Running Bear continued. "Apache warriors will secure the passenger cars and eliminate external guards. Morrison, Cassandra, and Mendoza will breach the armored car containing Wright's documents." "What about Wright himself?" Cassandra asked. "He'll be in one of the passenger cars, probably the most heavily defended one." Morrison's expression hardened. "We don't go after Wright directly. Our mission is to get the evidence and get out. If we start trying to settle personal scores, people die unnecessarily." "Even after everything he's done," Cassandra pressed, "all the families he's murdered, especially because of everything he's done," Morrison replied firmly. "Wright's victims deserve justice, not revenge. There's a difference." Cassandra nodded, though privately she wondered if she would be able to restrain herself if she came face to face with the man who had ordered so much suffering. As the meeting broke up and the participants prepared for the coming battle, Morrison found himself standing at the cave mouth once again, looking out at stars that seemed impossibly distant and clean compared to the bloody work that awaited them. Cassandra joined him there, moving carefully because of her healing ribs, but with growing confidence in her own capabilities. "Having second thoughts?" she asked quietly. "Third and fourth thoughts," Morrison admitted. "This whole plan depends on too many things going right at exactly the right time. If Iron Hawk's diversion is too early or too late, if Mendoza's charges don't stop the train cleanly, if Wright has more guards than we expect, then we improvise," Cassandra finished. "Isn't that what you told me when we were hanging from that cliff? Sometimes crazy is all you've got." Morrison looked at her, noting how much she had changed in just a few days. The pampered railroad wife had been replaced by a woman who could plan military operations and speak of killing with calm determination. He wasn't sure whether that transformation was entirely positive, but he admired her strength. "Cassandra," he said carefully, "after this is over, assuming we survive what happens then, you can never go back to your old life. Wright will hunt you until one of you is dead." She considered the question, her eyes on the distant mountains where her future lay hidden like gold in an unmined vein. "I don't want my old life back," she said finally. "That woman, the one who attended charity luncheons and worried about dress colors, she was already dead. She just didn't know it yet." She turned to face him directly. "The question is, what kind of life do we build together after this is finished?" The word "together" hung between them like a bridge across a chasm. Morrison realized that somewhere in the midst of gunfights and desperate escapes, they had become something more than allies of convenience. They had become partners in the deepest sense, 2 people who had found in each other the strength to become more than they had been alone. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'd like to find out." She smiled, then the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since they'd met. "Then let's make sure we survive tomorrow's work." The morning of the train robbery dawned clear and cold with a wind that carried the scent of snow from the high peaks. Morrison woke before sunrise, his soldier's instincts responding to the importance of the day ahead. Around him, Apache warriors were making their final preparations, checking weapons, painting war symbols on their faces, speaking quiet words to the spirits of their ancestors. Cassandra was already awake, sitting with Consuela and learning a traditional Apache blessing for warriors going into battle. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she looked calm and determined. "Ready?" Morrison asked as he approached. "As ready as someone can be for their first train robbery," she replied with a nervous laugh, "though I suspect this wasn't covered in my finishing school curriculum." Mendoza appeared with his explosives, the shaped charges carefully packed in a leather satchel that he guarded like a mother protecting her children. "Everything is prepared, amigos. Now we just need a little luck and a lot of courage." The ride to Devil's Bend took 3 hours through terrain that tested both horse and rider. The Apache warriors moved with their customary silence, but Morrison could feel the tension building as they approached their target. This wasn't just another raid or cattle theft. This was a strike at the heart of the system that had oppressed and murdered their people. They reached the ambush site with an hour to spare, giving them time to position charges on the railroad tracks and establish firing positions among the rocks and scrub pine that lined the cutting. From their vantage point, they could see for miles in both directions along the railroad line. "Remember," Morrison told the assembled fighters, "we're here for documents, not bloodshed. Kill only when necessary to protect yourselves or complete the mission." At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Ironhawk's diversion attack began. They couldn't see Silver Creek from Devil's Bend, but the distant sound of gunfire carried on the wind, along with smoke that rose from what was probably a burning building. "Right on time," Mendoza observed with professional appreciation. "That old Apache knows his business." 15 minutes later, the train appeared on the eastern horizon, a black speck that grew steadily larger as it approached their position. Even from a distance, Morrison could see that this was no ordinary passenger train. Armored cars gleamed dully in the afternoon sun, and armed guards were visible on the platforms between cars. "Madre de Dios," Mendoza breathed. "Wright is not taking any chances." As the train drew closer, they could make out more details. The locomotive was a massive 462 Pacific, built for speed and power. Behind it came a heavily armored express car, followed by 2 passenger cars that had been fitted with gun ports and steel plating. At the rear, a final armored car served as both fortress and arsenal. 4 cars, Morrison counted. Figure 20 to 30 guards plus Wright's personal entourage. We're looking at serious firepower. The train entered the cutting at Devil's Bend at reduced speed, its wheels singing against the rails as the massive locomotive negotiated the curve. Morrison held his breath, waiting for the precise moment when the engine would be positioned over Mendoza's charges. "Now," he whispered, and Mendoza triggered the explosives. The shaped charges detonated with a roar that echoed off the canyon walls, sending a geyser of smoke and debris high into the air. The locomotive's front wheels left the rails, and the massive engine tilted sideways before coming to rest at a crazy angle, blocking the tracks completely. "Vámonos!" Mendoza shouted, leading the charge down toward the disabled train. What followed was the most intense 10 minutes of Morrison's life. Apache warriors poured down from the rocks, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls as they engaged Wright's guards in desperate close-quarters combat. Rifles cracked and revolvers barked, filling the air with gunsmoke and the screams of wounded men. Morrison and Cassandra fought their way toward the armored express car, where Mendoza was already placing his remaining charges on the reinforced door. The Mexican bandit worked with calm precision, despite the bullets whining around him, his hands steady as he prepared to breach their primary target. 30 seconds, Mendoza called out, backing away from his handiwork. The explosion that followed was smaller than the one that had stopped the train, but infinitely more precise. The armored door disappeared in a shower of twisted metal, revealing the interior of Wright's mobile strongroom. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents representing years of meticulous record-keeping by a man who trusted nothing to memory. Cassandra immediately began sorting through the documents, her trained eye identifying the most important materials. "Financial records," she called out, stuffing papers into a satchel. "Correspondence with federal officials. And Jake, look at this." She held up a leather portfolio that contained not just documents, but photographs, dozens of them showing Apache massacre sites that made even the hardened Morrison wince. These weren't just records of Wright's crimes. They were trophies kept like a hunter might preserve the pelts of particularly prized kills. That sick bastard. Morrison breathed, understanding for the first time the true depth of Wright's depravity. They were still gathering evidence when Cassandra suddenly froze, her attention caught by a voice carrying over the battle noise from one of the passenger cars. "Kill them all!" Nathaniel Wright was shouting. "I don't care how many men we lose. That woman must not leave this canyon alive." The voice of her husband, filled with murderous rage, galvanized Cassandra into action. She began gathering documents with renewed urgency, her movements quick and efficient despite her injuries. "That's enough," Morrison said, noting that Wright's guards were beginning to organize a counterattack. "We need to go." But as they prepared to leave the breached express car, Elena Santos appeared in the doorway like a dark angel of death. The woman who had claimed to be Wright's sister held a smoking revolver in each hand, and her eyes burned with professional hatred. "Going somewhere?" she asked in accented English that now sounded more European than Mexican. Morrison's hand moved toward his Colt, but Elena was faster. Her left-hand gun fired the bullet, creasing his ribs and spinning him around. Cassandra screamed and tried to draw her own weapon, but Elena's right-hand gun was already trained on her heart. "I don't think so, Senora Wright," Elena said with a cold smile. "You have caused my employer considerable inconvenience. It is time to settle accounts." But before she could pull the trigger, a tomahawk sprouted from her shoulder, thrown with deadly accuracy by Nalnish as he leaped from the roof of the express car. Elena screamed and spun away, both guns flying from her hands as she crashed into the wall of filing cabinets. "Go!" Nalnish shouted in English. "More guards coming!" Morrison and Cassandra stumbled out of the express car just as a fresh wave of Wright's men poured from the passenger cars. The Apache warriors were holding their own, but the superior firepower of the guards was beginning to tell. "Fall back," Running Bear commanded in Apache. "We have what we came for." The retreat from the train was a fighting withdrawal that tested every skill Morrison had learned in 8 years of cavalry service. Apache warriors provided covering fire, while the document teams made their escape, but Wright's guards pursued them with grim determination. They had almost reached the safety of the rocks when disaster struck. A guard with a Spencer repeating rifle found his mark, and Morrison felt the impact as the bullet struck him high in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. "Jake!" Cassandra dropped beside him, her hands immediately going to the wound. Blood was spreading across his shirt with alarming speed. "Go!" Morrison gasped, his vision already beginning to blur. "Take the documents. Get them to someone who can—" "I'm not leaving you," Cassandra said fiercely, trying to staunch the bleeding with strips torn from her own clothing. Around them the battle continued to rage, but Morrison could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. The irony wasn't lost on him. After surviving years of Apache wars and cavalry charges, he might die in a railroad cutting while trying to expose the corruption that had killed his wife. But then Consuela and 3 Apache warriors appeared, forming a protective circle around the wounded white man who had become their ally. Working together, they managed to carry Morrison to safety while Cassandra gathered the scattered documents. As they retreated into the mountains, leaving Wright's disabled train behind, Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he could hear Cassandra talking to him, her voice a lifeline that kept him anchored to the world of the living. "Stay with me, Jake," she said over and over. "We did it. We got the evidence. Justice is finally within reach." But Morrison's last coherent thought before darkness claimed him was that justice and survival were 2 very different things, and they had only achieved one of them. The wound festered like the corruption it had been earned fighting. Jake Morrison lay unconscious for 3 days in the sacred caves, his breathing shallow and labored while Apache medicine women worked their ancient healing arts alongside what limited medical knowledge Cassandra possessed. She barely left his side, her hands alternately checking his fever and sorting through the stolen documents that might yet bring justice to a territory drowning in blood and gold. "He is walking between worlds," Consuela said quietly, applying a poultice made from mountain herbs to Morrison's chest wound. "The spirits are deciding whether to call him home or send him back to finish his work." Cassandra looked down at Morrison's pale face, noting how the fever had carved away the last traces of softness, leaving only the essential structure of the man. Strong bones, stubborn jaw, the weathered features of someone who had endured much and surrendered nothing. "He can't die," she whispered more to herself than to Consuela. "Not when we're so close to exposing the truth." But as she spoke, the words Cassandra realized her fear went far deeper than concerns about justice or evidence. Somewhere in the crucible of shared danger, Jake Morrison had become the other half of her soul, the man who had shown her what true partnership could look like, what love without ownership might become. Running Bear appeared at the mouth of the healing chamber, his weathered face grim with new concerns. "We have visitors approaching from the south," he said quietly. "Many horses moving fast. Not Apache." Cassandra felt her heart sink. "Wright's men." "Worse," Running Bear replied. "Federal cavalry flying a general's pennant. Blackwood himself is coming with enough soldiers to surround these mountains." The news sent a chill through the cave. General Harrison Blackwood commanded the respect and fear of every fighting man in the territory. If he was leading this pursuit personally, it meant Wright had convinced Washington that this was a matter of national security rather than simple criminal investigation. "How long do we have?" Cassandra asked, her mind already racing through possibilities. "Maybe 6 hours before they can position artillery within range of the caves," Running Bear said. "After that?" He shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of a man who had fought impossible odds before. Cassandra looked at the documents scattered around Morrison's sickbed, photographs that documented systematic genocide, financial records that revealed corruption reaching to the highest levels of government correspondence that would destroy careers and topple administrations if it ever reached the right hands. All of it worthless if they were trapped in these caves and killed as hostile insurgents. "We need to get this evidence to someone who can act on it," she said with sudden determination. "Someone beyond Wright's reach." "Who?" Running Bear asked pragmatically. "Wright has bought or intimidated everyone in the territorial government. The federal investigators are dead. Even the newspapers are afraid to publish stories that might anger the railroad interests." Cassandra stared at the documents, her mind working through possibilities that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. Then she remembered something, a conversation overheard at one of Nathaniel's dinner parties, a casual mention of someone who had been causing trouble for railroad interests. "Samuel Clemens," she said suddenly. "The writer. He's been publishing articles critical of railroad corruption in Eastern newspapers." Running Bear looked puzzled. "A storyteller, what good can words do against bullets?" "You'd be surprised," Cassandra replied, remembering the power of the written word to shape public opinion. "Clemens has been traveling through the West, documenting the excesses of the railroad barons. If we could get this evidence to him." "Where is this word warrior now?" Running Bear asked, his tone suggesting he remained skeptical of the plan. Cassandra thought back to the society pages she'd read just weeks ago, a lifetime ago, when her biggest concern had been choosing the right dress for social functions. Virginia City, Nevada. He's covering the silver mining boom for Eastern newspapers. "That's 200 miles north," Running Bear observed, "through territory now swarming with federal troops looking for us." "Then we'd better not get caught," Cassandra said with a determination that surprised even herself. Morrison stirred restlessly on his makeshift bed, his fever-bright eyes opening briefly to focus on Cassandra's face. "Train," he whispered hoarsely. We got it all," Cassandra assured him, taking his burning hand in both of hers. "Evidence that will hang Wright and half the territorial government. But Jake, we need to get you to a real doctor." Morrison's eyes closed again, but his hand squeezed hers weakly. "Virginia City," he mumbled, surprising her with his lucidity. "Clemens, good man, honest." "You know him?" Cassandra asked. "Met him in Carson City, 2 years ago. He was investigating mining claims corruption. Fearless bastard. Wouldn't back down even when threatened." Morrison's voice trailed off, his consciousness slipped away again. Running Bear studied Morrison's pale face with the practiced eye of a man who had seen many warriors battle death. "He cannot travel in this condition. The journey would kill him." "Then we take him anyway," Cassandra said fiercely, "because staying here will kill us all." The next few hours passed in frantic preparation. Apache warriors scouted routes through the mountains that might avoid federal patrols, while the medicine women prepared Morrison for a journey that could easily prove fatal in his weakened condition. Cassandra organized the evidence into portable packages, prioritizing the most damning documents and photographs. As the sun reached its zenith, the sound of distant artillery fire echoed through the mountains. Blackwood's forces had begun shelling the lower slopes, systematically working their way toward the sacred caves. Time to go, Running Bear announced. Ironhawk's warriors will provide a rearguard action to cover our retreat, but they cannot hold the Federals for long. Morrison was loaded onto a travois, pulled by Running Bear's strongest horse, his unconscious form wrapped in blankets and buffalo robes. Cassandra rode beside him, one hand on the reins of her mount, the other checking his pulse every few minutes. The escape route led through terrain that would have challenged healthy travelers on foot. For a cavalcade carrying wounded and elderly refugees, it was a nightmare of switchback trails and rockfalls that threatened disaster at every turn. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from behind them. Cassandra looked back to see a lone rider pushing his horse hard up the mountain trail, Naelnish blood streaming from a wound on his scalp, his face grim with urgent news. "Federal cavalry," he gasped as he reached them. "Full company, maybe more. They found our trail and are following fast. Ironhawk's rearguard has been scattered." Running Bear cursed in Apache, then made a quick decision that would determine whether any of them lived to see another sunset. "Take the wounded and elderly by the northern trail," he commanded. "I will lead the warriors south to draw off pursuit." "That's suicide," Cassandra protested. "Blackwood has artillery support and fresh horses. You'll be slaughtered." "Perhaps," Running Bear agreed calmly, "but you will live to deliver your evidence to the word warrior. That is what matters now." It was the hardest decision of Cassandra's life to ride away while brave men sacrificed themselves to give her a chance at justice, but she understood that personal honor mattered less than the larger cause they were fighting for. "Tell Ironhawk," she said to Running Bear, "that his nephew's death will not be forgotten. Tell him the evidence we carry will make sure the whole world knows what Wright did at Bitter Creek." Running Bear nodded solemnly, then clasped her hand in the traditional Apache farewell. "Ride fast, Cassandra Wright, who fights like lightning. May the spirits guide your path." The separation was agonizing but necessary. Cassandra led the small group of refugees northward, while Running Bear and his warriors disappeared into the southern canyons, drawing the federal pursuit away from the precious cargo of evidence. For the next day and night, they rode through terrain that tested every survival skill Cassandra had learned in her week of desperate flight. Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever spiking dangerously as the rough travel aggravated his wound. Twice they had to hide while federal patrols passed nearby, pressing themselves against canyon walls and praying that their horses wouldn't whinny at the wrong moment. Each time Cassandra held her breath and counted heartbeats, knowing that discovery meant death for all of them. It was on the second day that they encountered the unexpected. A dust cloud on the northern horizon resolved into a group of horsemen riding toward them at full gallop. Cassandra's hand moved to her rifle, prepared to make a final stand, when she recognized something familiar about the lead rider's posture. "Carlos," she called out, recognizing Mendoza despite the bandage wrapped around his head. "What are you doing here?" The Mexican bandit reined in beside Morrison's travois, his dark eyes taking in the wounded man's condition with obvious concern. "Looking for you, amiga. Word reached us that Blackwood was closing in on the sacred caves." "Us?" Cassandra asked, noting the riders behind Mendoza, a mixed group of Mexican vaqueros, displaced miners, and what looked like former cavalry soldiers. "Men who have their own reasons to hate Wright and Blackwood," Mendoza explained. "We have been organizing in the hidden valleys, preparing for the day when the oppression becomes too much to bear. That day, it seems, has arrived." The reinforcements changed everything. With Mendoza's men providing security, they could travel faster and take more direct routes toward Virginia City. More importantly, they had enough fighters to potentially break through any federal roadblocks that might be waiting ahead. But Morrison's condition continued to deteriorate. By the third day, he was burning with fever and barely conscious, his breathing so shallow that Cassandra had to put her ear to his chest to detect signs of life. "There is a doctor in Silver Springs," Mendoza said as they paused to rest the horses. "German fellow used to treat gunshot wounds during the war. If anyone can save your man, it is Dr. Schmidt." Silver Springs was only 20 miles out of their way, but it was also directly in the path of federal patrols hunting for them. Cassandra studied Morrison's pale face, noting how the fever had burned away the last reserves of strength that had carried him through the train robbery. "Do it," she decided. "If we lose Jake, everything we've suffered means nothing." Dr. Klaus Schmidt turned out to be a compact, efficient man in his 50s who asked no questions and demanded payment in advance. His clinic in Silver Springs was a converted saloon that still smelled faintly of whiskey and tobacco, but his medical credentials were displayed prominently on the walls. Lung puncture infection setting in, he diagnosed after examining Morrison. The bullet fragment is pressing against vital organs. I can remove it, but the surgery will be dangerous. More dangerous than leaving it? Cassandra asked. In his current condition, perhaps not, but if he survives the operation, he will need weeks of recovery time. We don't have weeks, Cassandra said desperately. Federal troops are hunting us. We need to reach Virginia City before... Then your friend will die, Schmidt said bluntly. Medicine is not a negotiation with time, Fraulein. It has its own requirements. Cassandra looked down at Morrison's unconscious form, seeing not just the man who had saved her life, but the partner who had helped her discover her own strength. The decision was impossible: stay and risk capture by federal forces, or continue the journey and watch the man she loved die by degrees. The choice was taken away from her by Morrison himself. Do the surgery? He whispered, his eyes opening with startling clarity. But if federal troops come, leave me behind. Get the evidence to Clemens. Jake, no, Cassandra began, but Morrison's hand found hers with surprising strength. Promise me, he said urgently. Promise you won't let my death make their sacrifices meaningless. Tears streaming down her face, Cassandra made a promise she prayed she'd never have to keep. The surgery took 3 hours, with Mendoza's men standing guard while Dr. Schmidt worked by lamplight to extract the bullet fragment from Morrison's chest. Cassandra assisted as best she could, her hands steady despite her emotional turmoil. When it was over, Morrison was alive but unconscious, his breathing shallow but regular. Schmidt cleaned his instruments with Germanic precision before delivering his verdict. The surgery was successful, but he has lost much blood. He needs rest, proper food, and time for his body to heal. 2 weeks minimum before he should even think about traveling. We don't have 2 weeks, Mendoza said from his position at the window. Federal patrols have been seen within 10 miles of town. Soon they will begin searching buildings. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the main street. Cassandra moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her heart sinking as she recognized the blue uniforms and brass buttons of cavalry troopers. 20 men, she reported quietly. They're setting up checkpoints at both ends of town. Schmidt nodded grimly. There is a back room where you can hide your friend, but if they search thoroughly... They won't need to search, came a familiar voice from the clinic's rear entrance, because I'm going to tell them exactly where you are. Elena Santos stepped into the clinic, her left arm in a sling from Nalnish's tomahawk wound, but her gun hand steady as she trained a Colt .45 on Cassandra's heart. Behind her came 2 hard-looking men who were obviously professional killers. Senora Cassandra Wright, Elena said with cold satisfaction. Or should I say the notorious traitor who has been selling military secrets to hostile Apache forces? That's a lie, and you know it, Cassandra replied, though she could see her own death reflected in Elena's dark eyes. Truth is, whatever the newspapers print, Elena said with a shrug. And Wright's newspapers will print a very specific story about your capture and unfortunate death while resisting arrest. She gestured to one of her companions. Rodriguez, check the wounded man. If he's still alive, put a bullet in his brain. We can't afford witnesses. Cassandra moved instinctively to block Rodriguez's path to Morrison's bedside. You'll have to go through me first. Elena's smile was as cold as winter moonlight. That can be arranged. But before she could pull the trigger, Dr. Schmidt stepped forward with surprising courage for a middle-aged civilian. Wait, he said firmly. I am a citizen of the German Empire. If you murder patients in my clinic, it will create an international incident. Elena paused, clearly weighing the political implications. Wright's empire was built on maintaining plausible deniability. Random violence was counterproductive if it drew unwanted attention from federal authorities. You make a good point, Doctor, she admitted. Very well, Rodriguez seized the woman's saddlebags. The documents she stole are what Wright really wants. We can always kill her later. Rodriguez moved toward the bags containing the evidence, but Cassandra was faster. She grabbed the leather satchel and clutched it to her chest, backing toward Morrison's bed. These documents prove your employer is a mass murderer, she said desperately. Are you really willing to help cover up genocide for railroad money? I am willing to do whatever pays best, Elena replied pragmatically, and Wright pays very well indeed. The standoff might have ended badly for Cassandra, if not for an unexpected intervention. The clinic's front window exploded inward as Mendoza and two of his men burst through, guns blazing. The room erupted into chaos as everyone dove for cover. Elena's men returned fire, their bullets shattering medical instruments and embedding themselves in the wooden walls. Dr. Schmidt crawled behind his desk, shouting in German about the sanctity of medical facilities. In the confusion, Cassandra grabbed the evidence bags and dragged them toward Morrison's bed, using his unconscious form as cover while bullets flew overhead. She could hear Elena shouting orders in rapid Spanish, organizing her men for a fighting withdrawal. "The woman," Elena called out. "Kill the woman and get those documents." Rodriguez appeared at the foot of Morrison's bed, his pistol aimed at Cassandra's head. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she stared death in the face and found herself strangely unafraid. She had done everything possible to expose Wright's crimes. If she died now, at least others might carry on the fight. But Morrison's eyes opened at that crucial moment, and despite his wounds, his hand found the derringer he kept hidden beneath his pillow. The small gun barked once, and Rodriguez toppled backward with a surprised expression, clutching his chest. "Still not dead?" Morrison gasped, his pale face creased in something that might have been a grin. The gunfight continued for several more minutes before Elena made the tactical decision to withdraw. Her remaining man was wounded. Federal cavalry was approaching, and the evidence she'd come to retrieve was still in enemy hands. "This isn't over," she called out as she backed toward the rear exit. "Wright has resources you can't imagine. He'll find you wherever you run." "Let him try," Cassandra replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I'm not running anymore." After Elena and her surviving gunmen had disappeared into the night, Mendoza's men quickly organized a fighting withdrawal from Silver Springs. Federal cavalry was indeed approaching, and there was no time for extended medical care. Dr. Schmidt did what he could to stabilize Morrison for travel, providing laudanum for the pain and clean bandages for the journey ahead. "Keep the wound clean and dry," he instructed Cassandra. "And if fever returns, find willow bark tea. It may help." They loaded Morrison onto the most comfortable wagon they could commandeer and set out into the night, navigating by stars and instinct toward Virginia City and their appointment with Samuel Clemens. The next week was a blur of hidden camps and forced marches through terrain that seemed designed to test human endurance. Morrison drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes speaking coherently about their mission, sometimes calling out for Ayana in languages that mixed English with Apache words. Cassandra barely slept, dividing her time between nursing Morrison and organizing the evidence they carried. She created multiple copies of the most important documents, hiding them in different locations throughout their baggage. If Wright's men caught up to them again, at least some of the evidence might survive. It was on the 10th day after leaving Silver Springs that they finally crested the hills overlooking Virginia City and saw the sprawling mining boomtown spread out below them like a promise of civilization and safety. "Almost there," Cassandra whispered to Morrison, who had been unconscious for most of the past 2 days. "Just a little further, and we can rest." But even as she spoke the words, she spotted dust clouds on the horizon behind them, eiders approaching fast, too many to be anything other than military pursuit. "Federals," Mendoza confirmed grimly, studying the distant figures through a spyglass. "Full company, maybe more. They'll reach us within the hour." The irony was crushing to come so far, to endure so much, only to be captured within sight of their destination. Cassandra stared at the approaching troops, her mind racing through rapidly diminishing options. "Take the evidence and ride for town," Morrison said weakly, his eyes open and surprisingly clear. "Leave me here. I'll slow them down as long as I can." "No," Cassandra said firmly. "We finish this together or not at all." "Stubborn woman," Morrison said with something that might have been fondness. "Going to get us both killed with that attitude." "Maybe," Cassandra agreed. "But at least we'll die free." Mendoza had been studying the approaching cavalry through his spyglass, and suddenly his expression changed. "Madre de Dios," he exclaimed. "Those are not Federals." "What?" Cassandra grabbed the spyglass and focused on the lead riders. What she saw made her heart leap with hope and disbelief. Iron Hawk rode at the head of a war party that included not just Apache warriors, but Mexican vaqueros, displaced miners, and what looked like deserters from various military units. They flew no flag except a blood-red bandana tied to Ironhawk's lance, the symbol of resistance to oppression. "How is that possible?" Morrison asked, struggling to sit up despite his wounds. "I thought Blackwood scattered Ironhawk's forces." "Apparently not," Mendoza said with a fierce grin. "It seems our Apache friend has been busy recruiting allies." The war party reached them within minutes, and Ironhawk's first concern was for Morrison's condition. Despite their earlier tensions, the Apache war chief had developed genuine respect for the white man who fought beside them against common enemies. "You look like death walking," Ironhawk observed bluntly. "But you are still walking. That is something." "How did you find us?" Cassandra asked, still overwhelmed by this unexpected rescue. "Running Bear sent word before he died." Ironhawk replied, his voice heavy with grief. "He held the Federals for 3 days in Devil's Canyon, buying time for your escape. His last message was to protect you until you reached the Word Warrior." The news hit Cassandra like a physical blow. Running Bear, who had shown her kindness and respect when she was just a frightened refugee, had died to give her a chance at justice. The debt was one she could never repay, but she could honor his sacrifice by completing their mission. "Then let's not let his death be meaningless," she said with renewed determination. "Virginia City is just ahead. Let's go find Samuel Clemens." Virginia City in 1873 was a boomtown that never slept, its streets filled with miners, merchants, gamblers, and dreamers, drawn by the promise of silver wealth. The arrival of a mixed group of Apache warriors, Mexican bandits, and Anglo fugitives caused considerable stir. But in a town where fortunes were made and lost, daily unusual sights were part of the landscape. They found Samuel Clemens in the offices of the Territorial Enterprise, the local newspaper where he had been working as a correspondent while gathering material for his articles about Western corruption. He was a man in his late 30s with unruly hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. "Mrs. Wright," he said after Cassandra had introduced herself and outlined their situation, "I've been following your husband's activities with considerable interest. The man has a talent for making headlines, though usually not the kind he prefers." Cassandra spread the stolen documents across his desk: photographs, financial records, correspondence that painted a picture of systematic corruption and genocide. Clemens studied them with the analytical eye of a trained journalist, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. "Remarkable," he said finally. "This evidence could topple the territorial government and reach all the way to Washington. But you understand that publishing these allegations will make powerful enemies." "We already have powerful enemies," Morrison said from his chair by the window. Despite his wounds, he had insisted on being present for this crucial meeting. "Question is, do you have the courage to take them on?" Clemens smiled grimly. "Mr. Morrison, I've been taking on corrupt officials and railroad barons for most of my career. The question is whether you have the patience to let justice work through proper channels." "What do you mean?" Cassandra asked. "These documents need to reach the right people in Washington, congressmen who aren't in Wright's pocket, federal prosecutors who can't be bought. That takes time, and it requires keeping you alive long enough to testify when the time comes." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the street outside. Clemens moved to the window and cursed at what he saw. "Federal cavalry," he reported grimly. "And unless I'm mistaken, that's General Blackwood himself in the lead." Indeed, General Harrison Blackwood rode at the head of a full company of cavalry, his face grim with purpose as he surveyed the chaotic streets of Virginia City. Behind him came wagons carrying artillery pieces and enough ammunition to reduce the entire town to rubble if necessary. "He means business," Morrison observed, checking the loads in his revolver despite his weakened condition. "So do we," Cassandra replied, her own hand moving to the rifle she'd carried through so many desperate battles. "The question is, how do we get this evidence to Washington if we're all dead?" Clemens was already moving, gathering the documents and stuffing them into multiple envelopes. "Leave that to me," he said with calm efficiency. "I have contacts throughout the territory, other journalists, federal investigators, even some honest politicians. If something happens to me, they have instructions to forward any materials I send them directly to specific congressmen." He handed Cassandra one of the envelopes. "This contains copies of the most damning evidence. If we're separated, get it to Judge William Story in Carson City. He's one of the few federal officials Wright hasn't been able to corrupt." The sound of boots on the stairs outside interrupted their planning. Blackwood's men were already searching the building, working their way up floor by floor. "Back exit?" Morrison asked, struggling to his feet despite his obvious pain. "Leads to an alley that connects to the mine workings," Clemens replied. "But Blackwood's men will have thought of that too." Indeed, even as he spoke, they could hear voices from the alley below, more federal troops positioned to cut off exactly that escape route. "Looks like we make our stand here," Morrison said with grim acceptance. "At least we'll go down fighting." But Cassandra was studying the room with a different eye, noting the windows, the furniture, the layout that might offer unexpected possibilities. Her weeks of desperate flight had taught her to think tactically, to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. "Not necessarily," she said, moving to a window that overlooked the building's rear courtyard. "Iron Hawk and his warriors are still out there. If we can signal them—" She used her rifle to break the window glass, then fired 3 space shots into the air, the Apache signal for assistance. Within moments, war cries echoed from multiple directions as Iron Hawk's fighters moved to surround the federal troops. What followed was the Battle of Virginia City, a running firefight through streets and buildings that lasted until well after midnight. Apache warriors used their knowledge of guerrilla tactics to harass the federal cavalry, while Mendoza's men provided covering fire from rooftops and alleyways. Blackwood's superior numbers and firepower gradually began to tell, but not before Clemens had managed to dispatch riders carrying copies of Wright's evidence to multiple destinations. Whatever happened to the original participants, the truth would survive. The end came suddenly and unexpectedly. As Cassandra and Morrison fought their way through a maze of mine tunnels beneath the town, they found themselves face to face with the man who had started it all. Nathaniel Wright stood in the entrance to one of the mine shafts, elegant even in his traveling clothes, flanked by Elena Santos and 2 professional gunmen. His face showed not rage but cold calculation, the expression of a man cleaning up loose ends. "Hello, my dear," he said to Cassandra with the same tone he might use to greet her at a dinner party. "You've led me quite a chase." "Nathaniel," Cassandra replied, noting how strange his name sounded after everything she'd experienced. This man seemed like a stranger now, a figure from someone else's life. "I must say you've changed considerably since you fled our home," Wright continued conversationally. "The frightened, obedient wife has been replaced by something quite different. I'm almost impressed." "Almost?" Morrison asked, his gun trained on Wright despite his obvious exhaustion. "Well, it's a pity that her transformation came too late to save her life," Wright replied with casual cruelty. "Elena, if you would be so kind." Elena Santos raised her weapon, but before she could fire, the mine tunnel erupted with the sound of Apache war cries. Nyalnish and 3 warriors burst from a side passage, their sudden appearance throwing Wright's men into confusion. In the gunfight that followed, Elena Santos finally met her end, not from a bullet, but from Nyalnish's tomahawk thrown with the skill that had made him legendary among his people. She died as she had lived, violently and without remorse. Wright himself proved more elusive. As his gunmen fell around him, he backed toward the mine shaft's exit, his face showing the first cracks in his composed facade. "This isn't over," he called out as he reached the tunnel mouth. "I have resources connections. I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Then you'll die tired," Morrison replied, but Wright had already disappeared into the darkness. The final confrontation came at dawn on the rimrock overlooking Virginia City. Wright had somehow obtained a horse and weapons and was attempting to escape toward the state line when Morrison and Cassandra finally caught up to him. The man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds stood alone against the sunrise, his railroad empire crumbling behind him as Clemens's dispatches reached their destinations throughout the territory. "It's over, Nathaniel," Cassandra called out, her rifle trained on the man she had once promised to love and honor. "Surrender and you might live to stand trial." Wright laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Stand trial before whom? The federal judges I've bought? The politicians who owe their careers to railroad money?" He shook his head. "You still don't understand how the world really works, my dear." "I understand that the world is changing," Cassandra replied, "and men like you are being left behind." Wright's hand moved toward his gun, but Morrison was faster despite his wounds. The shot echoed across the desert like the crack of doom, and Nathaniel Wright fell backward off the rimrock, his body disappearing into the canyon below. "Is it finished?" Cassandra asked, staring at the spot where her husband had stood moments before. "The personal part is," Morrison replied, holstering his smoking Colt. "But the work isn't done. Wright was just one man. The system that enabled him is still out there. 6 months later, Cassandra Wright, now Cassandra Morrison, stood in the offices of the Washington Post, watching as editor John Hay reviewed the final galley proofs of Samuel Clemens's expose on railroad corruption in the American West. Rails of Blood: How Corporate Greed Fueled Genocide in the Territories. Hay read aloud. Quite a title. Are you sure we want to take on the entire railroad establishment? The evidence speaks for itself, Cassandra replied, her hand resting on Jake's arm as he recovered from his long ordeal. And the American people deserve to know the truth. The articles, when published, did indeed create the sensation that Clemens had predicted. Congressional investigations were launched, corrupt officials were prosecuted, and new laws were passed to regulate corporate conduct in the territories. It wasn't perfect justice. Too many of the guilty escaped punishment. Too many of the dead would never see their murderers hang. But it was progress, and sometimes progress was all that could be hoped for. The Apache survivors, led by Ironhawk and the remaining Chiricahua, were granted a reservation in the mountains where they had hidden during their struggle against Wright's forces. It wasn't their original homeland, but it was a place where they could live according to their own customs, free from the interference of corrupt officials. Morrison and Cassandra built a small ranch on the edge of the reservation where they raised horses and children while continuing to fight for native rights through legal and political channels. It wasn't the life either of them had expected, but it was a life they had chosen together. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the desert stars burned bright overhead, Cassandra would sometimes remember the frightened woman who had fled from a mining camp with broken ribs and stolen documents. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a half-remembered dream. "Do you ever regret it?" Morrison asked one such evening, his arm around her as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains golden red. "Regret what?" Cassandra replied. "Giving up your old life, the fancy dresses, the society parties, the comfortable certainties." Cassandra considered the question, thinking of the Apache children playing in the dust nearby, the horses grazing in the pasture, the man beside her whose love had never tried to own or control her. "The only thing I regret," she said finally, "is that it took me so long to find out who I really was." Morrison smiled and pulled her closer. Understanding that some journeys couldn't be shortened, no matter how painful the path. They had both traveled far from where they started. From a bitter ex-soldier haunted by the ghosts of his failures, she, from a pampered socialite who had never questioned the world's injustices. The transformation hadn't been easy, and the scars would never completely fade. But like the desert flowers that bloomed after rare rains, they had found beauty in the harsh landscape of their shared struggle. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a wild, lonely sound that spoke of endless horizons and the freedom to choose one's own path. Cassandra Wright. Morrison listened to that call and smiled, knowing that she had finally found her place in the vast, unforgiving, beautiful West that had tested her so thoroughly and found her worthy. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise and remembrance, and in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against impossible odds planned for a future built on justice, love, and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the best things in life were worth fighting for.